Section 1. The World Before the War, Pre-War Mysteries and the Questions That Started Everything. There is something quietly unsettling about a world that burned itself to ash before you ever arrived. You walk through it, through the broken homes, through the dust-covered diners with plates still on the tables, through the rusted husks of cars that sit exactly where they were when the last driver simply stopped, and you feel it. That particular weight of a world that had plans it never got to carry out. Fallout's pre-war America is one of gaming's great constructions, a retro-futurist society that diverged from our own timeline at some unclear point in the mid-20th century, a world that got the nuclear age but kept the aesthetics of the 1950s forever, plastered in clean advertisements and bright colors long after those smiling faces had reason to smile. And beneath all of that cheerfulness, beneath every Nuka-Cola sign and every Robco advertisement, there was something rotten growing in the dark. The first mystery worth sitting with is also the oldest one, and it is deceptively simple. When exactly did the Fallout universe diverge from our own history? This moment is called the Divergence, and the games have never pinned it down with any real precision. The working assumption among fans and historians of the fiction is that it happened sometime after the Second World War. The Fallout universe seems to be aware that the war happened, and there are references to figures and events that align with real history up to a certain point. But somewhere in the late 1940s or early 1950s, the tracks split. The Fallout world never got the Cold War's gradual de-escalation. It never got détente. It never developed the Silicon Revolution in quite the same way. Instead, it stuck in a permanent amber of mid-century ideology, nationalism, consumerism, resource hunger, while the technology around it advanced in strange, asymmetric ways. You have nuclear-powered cars and household robots and advanced energy weapons, but computers are still massive reel-to-reel machines that fill entire rooms. Holotapes are the dominant storage medium in 2077. The transistor seems to have never caught on in quite the same fashion. Nobody knows when the divergence happened, and the games seem deliberately quiet on the subject. Even asking the question opens up philosophical ground the series seems content to leave unexplored. The second and arguably more loaded pre-war question is one that Tim Kaine, one of the original creators of Fallout, partially answered in 2023 during an interview, who fired the first nuclear weapon on October 23, 2077, the day of the Great War. For decades, this was the foundational mystery of the entire series. The games hint endlessly but commit to nothing. You find references to American aggression, Chinese espionage, political collapse, and mutual suspicion on a global scale. You find evidence of a world that was already fraying badly before the bombs fell. And then in 2023, Kaine explained in an interview that in his vision of the story, China fired first, but specifically because the United States had been secretly developing the forced evolutionary virus, a biological weapon that rewrites DNA at the cellular level. And when China discovered this, they launched nuclear weapons as retaliation. The United States, according to Kaine, had promised to stop the FEVI program when confronted, and had simply moved it to a different location instead. Then the Amazon Prime Fallout television series, which is fully canonical according to Bethesda's Todd Howard, offered a different and even more disturbing answer. The show implies strongly that it was Vault-Tec Corporation itself that triggered the Great War, that the corporation, having built the vaults and invested enormously in post-war survival infrastructure, chose to start the very war that would justify their existence. A company so committed to profiting from apocalypse that it manufactured the apocalypse. This is a mystery that has now been answered twice in contradictory ways, and the community remains divided on which interpretation to accept. The show is canon. Tim Kaine's version is the original author's intent, but is not itself a game or show. Both sit alongside each other, unresolved, in the gray space of a franchise with too many contributing voices. The third pre-war mystery is one that sits beneath the others like a geological layer, the forced evolutionary virus itself, and why it exists at all. The FEV is the biological engine behind most of the Fallout world's mutated horrors. Super mutants, in their various forms across the games, are the product of human exposure to FEVI. Deathclaws, in the original lore established in the first two Fallout games, were Jackson's chameleons enhanced through FEV exposure. Centaurs, floaters, much of the Wasteland's nightmarish fauna traces its origin to this single engineered pathogen. The FEV was developed at a place called the West-Tec Research Facility in the California desert. The original goal was to create a universal cure, a mutagen that could be tuned to counter any biological threat. Somewhere in the development process, the military application became the dominant one, and the program shifted toward creating super soldiers. And then the bombs fell, and the virus got out, and 200 years later, the consequences are still walking around the wasteland eating people. But here is the quiet mystery underneath all of that. Who approved the FEV program, and did they understand what they were creating? The Enclave, the rump government that survived the Great War in offshore oil rigs and hidden facilities, seems to have known about FEV from the very beginning and had plans for it. Their endgame in Fallout 2 involves using a modified, more lethal strain of FEV to clear out the mutated masses from the wasteland and repopulate it with pure humans, which means someone in the pre-war government was already thinking about using FEV as a culling mechanism before the bombs even fell. That is a level of premeditation that the games never quite confront directly. The implication sits there, in terminal entries and old documents, quietly enormous. The fourth pre-war mystery involves something called the divergence in resource allocation. In the Fallout universe, nuclear fusion technology was developed early and became the dominant energy source, hence the ubiquitous fusion cores that power everything from Pip-Boys to power armor. This should have, theoretically, solved the resource crisis that drives the entire plot of the series. Oil shortages, the resource wars, the annexation of Canada, the Sino-American War over petroleum reserves in Alaska, all of this could have been avoided if fusion power had been properly deployed. So, why wasn't it? The games never explain this satisfactorily. Fusion cells power individual devices, but the infrastructure for citywide or national fusion power grids seems to have never been built. Nuka-Cola factories run on electricity, houses have power, but the world is still strangling for resources. Some fans theorize that the technology was deliberately suppressed by energy corporations, who profited from the resource scarcity. Others point to the monopolization of fusion technology by corporations like General Atomics. The question of why a world with fusion power still went to war over oil is one of the series' most nagging logical gaps, and the game seems to invite you to sit with it rather than answer it. The fifth mystery is the fate of the rest of the world. The Fallout games are almost exclusively set in what was the continental United States, with Fallout New Vegas exploring the Mojave, Fallout 3 in what was Washington, D.C., Fallout 4 in the ruins of Boston, and Fallout 76 in West Virginia. We get glimpses of Canada, which was annexed by the United States before the Great War, in a move that apparently met with some violent resistance. We hear references to China repeatedly. There are hints of a European Commonwealth that fought its own resource wars and collapsed into internal conflict before the Great War even began. But we never see any of it. What does China look like 200 years after the bombs fell? The Fallout universe established that China had its own vaults or equivalents, and that the Chinese military was operating in Alaska with advanced stealth technology. There are Chinese soldiers in Fallout 3's Anchorage DLC. There is a Chinese submarine in Fallout 4's harbor. The world clearly extended beyond America's borders before the war. What does it look like now? Tim Kaine himself mentioned in that same 2023 interview that he had wanted to explore other countries in future Fallout games, and that doing so would have required the team to research how those societies might have developed along the Fallout universe's divergent timeline. The project never happened. The rest of the world remains a vast blank. The sixth pre-war mystery involves the Zetans, the aliens from Mothership Zeta, the Fallout 3 DLC that took the player aboard an extraterrestrial spacecraft. The Zetans had been abducting humans for centuries, gathering specimens and apparently studying them. Among those found frozen aboard the ship are a pre-war woman, a cowboy from the Old West, a samurai from feudal Japan, and an American soldier from the Alaska campaign. The aliens have been visiting Earth for a very long time, but why? What do they want? The DLC ends with the player escaping or destroying the ship, but the broader question of what the Zetans are doing here, whether they have any connection to the broader Fallout universe, whether they have influenced human history in any way, is left completely open. An audio log found within the ship implies that an alien signal may have influenced the launch of the nuclear missiles that started the Great War. This is presented and then left dangling, one of those pieces of information the game drops into your lap and then walks away from. Are the Zetans responsible for the Great War? The game does not say. It just leaves the idea sitting there in the dark, which is honestly more frightening than any direct answer would be. The seventh pre-war mystery is something smaller, something human-scaled, and perhaps more haunting for it. Scattered throughout the Fallout games are references to a pre-war program that was using the vaults as social experiments rather than genuine shelters. We know this now, and the games make it explicit. But there is a related question that never gets answered. How many ordinary Americans suspected the truth before they walked into those vaults? You find letters, you find journals, you find terminal entries written by people who were worried, people who had heard rumors, people who had noticed that the overseer seemed to know more than he was letting on. Some people clearly knew something was wrong. Did they get in anyway because outside was worse? Did they get in because they had families with them and couldn't bear to leave? Did some of them try to warn others? The Vault-Tec experiment was one of history's greatest betrayals. Hundreds of thousands of people told they were being saved when they were being studied. And somewhere in the space between the documents and the silence, there are the stories of the ones who figured it out too late. Drop a comment right now telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is, whether it's 2 in the morning and you can't sleep, or a quiet afternoon and you just want something to drift into. I want to know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps more of these reach people who need something to fall asleep to. Section 2. The Vaults. Sealed doors and the experiments nobody consented to. The vaults are the spine of the Fallout universe. Everything that has happened in the Wasteland, every faction, every survivor community, every philosophical debate about what humanity should rebuild itself into. All of it, in one way or another, traces back to those sealed doors and the people who walked through them. Vault-Tec Corporation officially built 122 vaults as part of Project Safehouse, a government contract that was sold to the American public as the ultimate nuclear insurance plan. For the right price, or simply by being selected, you got a spot in a vault that would keep you and your loved ones safe while the world burned. The advertisements were everywhere. The Pip-Boy 3000, that cheerful little wrist-mounted computer, was the symbol of vault culture. Cute mascots and reassuring narration told families that everything would be fine underground. Almost none of the vaults were what they claimed to be. The first real vault mystery is one of the oldest. What was Vault 13 actually for? This is the vault from the very first Fallout game, the one the player character is sent out from at the start of the story. On the surface, it seems like a relatively normal vault, sealed, functioning, maintaining its population 200 years after the bombs fell. The Overseer's primary directive was to keep the inhabitants inside as long as possible, which is how the game begins, with the Vault Dweller being sent outside to find a replacement water chip, rather than the Overseer choosing to open the vault. But there is a peculiar undercurrent to Vault 13. The Overseer is described as having been tasked, in the original lore, with keeping the population sealed, not for their safety, but to maintain an isolated, controlled sample population. The vault was essentially a long-term human containment experiment. The people inside were never meant to leave. They were being preserved, like specimens in a jar, and the desperate need for a water chip is what forced the story into motion, and, in doing so, accidentally broke the experiment. The mystery of why the Enclave needed that preserved, radiation-free human population becomes clear in Fallout 2, where you discover that the Enclave was collecting pure-strain humans for their post-war resettlement program, which means Vault 13's inhabitants were being kept alive for a specific purpose they were never told about. They weren't survivors, they were inventory. The second Vault mystery is Vault 12, in the town of Necropolis. Vault 12's door was deliberately designed not to seal properly. Vault-Tec intentionally sabotaged the door mechanism so that radiation would seep in and gradually irradiate the population. The inhabitants of Vault 12 became ghouls, the radiation-mutated, slow-aging survivors that appear throughout the series. The experiment was studying the long-term effects of radiation exposure on a closed population, and the results were, from a purely scientific standpoint, comprehensive. From a human standpoint, it was one of the most cold-blooded things in a long list of cold-blooded things that Vault-Tec did. These were people who paid for safety and received the opposite. The ghouls of Necropolis, by the time of the first game, are 200 years old and deeply bitter about it, which is entirely understandable. The third Vault mystery is Vault 11, which appears in Fallout New Vegas, and it represents perhaps the most philosophically cruel experiment in the entire Vault system. The inhabitants of Vault 11 were told, upon sealing, that they were required to sacrifice one of their number each year. A computer voice informed them that if they failed to provide a sacrifice, the entire vault would be destroyed. The message said that if they maintained the annual sacrifice, the vault would eventually be rewarded. The population, faced with this impossible situation, constructed an entire political civilization around the selection of the sacrifice. They formed parties, held elections, debated philosophy, created laws of succession. The vault became a microcosm of political theory, with the annual selection driving every aspect of social life. Factions formed to protect their members from selection. The weak were consistently offered up. A cult of self-sacrifice formed in opposition. Eventually, a civil war broke out. The terrible twist is revealed in the terminal entries. At some point before the Civil War, the Vault's population realized they could simply refuse the sacrifice. They could call the computer's bluff. 5 of them voted to defy the directive and face whatever consequence was promised. The expected annihilation did not come. Instead, a different message played, congratulating them for their defiance. The experiment, it said, was designed to test whether human beings could be conditioned into committing atrocities through social pressure and manufactured necessity. And the 5 survivors had just passed. Most of them did not live long enough to benefit from this information. The Civil War had already done most of the killing. Vault 11 is not just a mystery, it is an indictment. An experiment that was not studying survival, but studying how easily people could be made to participate in murder when the system told them it was necessary. The 4th Vault mystery involves Vault 34, also from New Vegas. Vault 34 was filled beyond capacity with weapons and ammunition. The experiment was straightforward in its cruelty. Would an overcrowded population with access to unlimited firepower eventually destroy itself? The answer, as you discover when you find the vault, is yes. But the mystery is not what happened. It is why it took as long as it did. The vault survived for a surprisingly long time before collapsing into violence, and the journals and terminals tell a story of a community that genuinely tried to maintain order in an impossible situation. They had rules about the weapons. They had storage protocols. They had a community that, for a while, actually functioned despite the absurdity of its circumstances. The collapse, when it came, was triggered not by the weapons, but by a water shortage. The overseer refused to let people leave even as the situation became untenable, and the violence that followed was the result of desperation as much as the available armament. The weapons were a catalyst. The real experiment was whether any social structure could survive the combination of overcrowding, resource scarcity, and authoritarian control. The 5th Vault mystery is Vault 68, which exists in the lore but is never visited in any game. The setup is one of the most discussed in the Fallout community. Vault 68 was sealed with 1 woman and 999 men. Nobody knows what happened inside. The vault exists as a reference point in various documents and terminal entries, and the imagination fills in the rest, which is precisely why Vault-Tec's designers included it. Sometimes the most effective horror is the one you construct yourself from the available information. The 6th Vault mystery is Vault 77, which was the subject of a canonical penny arcade webcomic series, but has never appeared in the games themselves. According to the comic, Vault 77 was sealed with 1 man and a crate of puppets. The inhabitant, driven to the edge of sanity by isolation, used the puppets to construct an elaborate social world and eventually emerged from the vault as a somewhat unhinged wanderer, the king of the puppets. There is no game content to confirm or deny this, but it is technically canonical, and the thought of a man spending decades building a civilization out of felt and wood before emerging into the wasteland is one of those perfectly Fallout images that sticks with you. The 7th Vault mystery is Vault 87, which appears in Fallout 3. This vault was used by the government to develop the FEV in-house. Residents were exposed to a strain of the virus, not for survivalist purposes, but for weapons development. The super mutants that roam the capital wasteland trace their origin to this vault, And the Master Glow's Rogue FEV modifications aside, the Vault-87 strain is a distinctly military product. What the experiment revealed about the relationship between Vault-Tec and the United States government, that they were co-producing biological weapons inside the same facility sold to the public as a shelter, is deeply troubling, and the game presents it almost matter-of-factly. By the time you read those terminal entries, you have already seen enough that nothing Vault-Tec did surprises you anymore. The 8th Vault mystery is Vault 101, the opening vault of Fallout 3, and it is mysterious not for any experiment but for its philosophy. The stated directive of Vault 101 was that the vault should never open, not to release its inhabitants, not to allow exit. The vault was to remain sealed indefinitely, a hermetically closed society that reproduced internally and maintained itself as a self-contained human ecosystem. Nobody knows why. The Overseer knows, or at least knows more than the residents, but the deeper question of what Vault-Tec or the Enclave expected to learn from a vault that simply refused to engage with the outside world at all is never answered. Was it testing whether total isolation could maintain social stability? Was it simply preserving a specific genetic and cultural strain? Was the Overseer operating on directives that had no rational justification beyond institutional momentum? The game leaves you to wonder. The 9th Vault mystery is one of the newest and comes from the Fallout television series. Vaults 31, 32, and 33, which existed as a linked trio in the ruins of what was Los Angeles. Vault 31 was used exclusively by Vault-Tec employees, kept in cryogenic stasis until needed. Vaults 32 and 33 were maintained as breeding populations, whose residents were periodically brought in to intermarry with Vault 31's inhabitants, ensuring that a pool of loyal, company-oriented management class would always be available to emerge from the vaults and rebuild the world according to Vault-Tec's vision. The fact that the inhabitants of 32 and 33 had no idea they were being managed in this way, that their carefully maintained community was essentially livestock for the executive class 2 doors away, is the kind of revelation that defines the series. The people in Vault 33, Lucy's community, genuinely believed they were preparing for the future. They were, just not their own. The 10th Vault mystery is the control vaults, the vaults that had no experiments. In order for the experimental data to be meaningful, some vaults were designated as controls, running normally with no artificial conditions imposed. Vault 8 from Fallout 2 is the most famous example. Its inhabitants emerged and built Vault City, a highly advanced community that maintained pre-war technology and developed a somewhat stratified society. Vault City stands in contrast to the experimental vaults as evidence of what could have been, what the vaults might have produced if they had simply done what they claimed to do. The existence of Vault City makes the experimental vaults even more damning by comparison. Look at what was possible. Look at what they chose to do instead. The 11th Vault mystery is the one that has never been explicitly addressed. What happened to the Vault-Tec employees who designed the experiments? The corporation's architects and scientists and administrators who sat in rooms and calmly designed systems of psychological torture and biological experimentation. Where did they go? Some worked directly for the Enclave, some presumably died in the war itself. But the people who made the decisions, the ones who approved Vault 11's sacrifice protocol and Vault 12's deliberately broken door, they are absent from the record, which is itself a kind of answer. History tends to be very good at losing the names of the ones who signed the orders. The 12th Vault mystery is perhaps the simplest and also the most chilling. How many vaults were there that we have never found? 122 were built. A fraction of those appear in the games. The rest are out there somewhere in the fiction, sealed or collapsed, or still running 200 years later, with populations that have no idea the world ended and reformed without them. There are vaults we will never see, experiments we will never discover. Somewhere in the game's implied geography, there is a sealed door with a number we have never been told, and behind it is a community that has been doing something terrible, or something beautiful, or something so ordinary that it would feel like a miracle, and we will never know which. Section 3. The Wasteland's strange geography, places that should not exist. The post-war landscape of Fallout is not simply a destroyed version of the real United States. It is something stranger than that. A world that has been cooking in radiation and mutation and human desperation for 2 centuries, and the cooking has produced results that no urban planner or geologist would recognize. There are places in the Wasteland that defy easy explanation, locations that accumulate significance beyond their obvious physical characteristics, places that feel like they mean something, even when the game declines to tell you what. The first and most discussed of these is the Glowing Sea, the region of the Commonwealth in Fallout 4 that occupies the area where a nuclear warhead hit the ground at close range. The Glowing Sea is everything its name suggests, a vast, featureless expanse of gray-green devastation where the background radiation is high enough to kill most unprotected humans in minutes. Nothing grows there except a few scrubby adaptations. The sky has a permanent sickly quality, filtered through decades of particulate matter and radioactive haze. And yet people live there. The children of Adam have a settlement in the deepest part of the Glowing Sea, in the ruins of a church that became a crater. They worship at the lip of the destruction, drawing meaning from ground zero. They are immune to the radiation or resistant enough that it does not kill them quickly, and they interpret this immunity as a gift from their God, evidence of divine favor in the most literal possible sense. The mystery of the Glowing Sea is not just what it is, but what it represents. It is the only location in any Fallout game that seems genuinely beyond recovery. Everything else in the Wasteland has people trying, in their fractured and imperfect ways, to build something. The Glowing Sea is just the end, a place where the world looked at what was done to it and gave up growing back. And yet even there, something survives. Something finds meaning. The second strange geography is a location from Fallout 3 that occupies a quiet corner of the capital Wasteland, a little red rocket station sitting at the edge of a field, which you can hear before you can see because there is music playing. Old American music, from before the war, coming from speakers that have been running for 200 years. The source is a robot, a Mr. Handy, that continues to perform his pre-war maintenance duties around the station with cheerful dedication, entirely unaware that the world he was designed to serve has been gone for generations. His name is not given, his story is not explained. The music plays, he maintains the station. The loneliness of that image, a robot doing his job in an empty world, for nobody, carries a weight that no amount of lore explanation could improve. It is purely an environmental mystery, and its power lies entirely in what it does not say. The third strange geography is the sinkhole network beneath Appalachia in Fallout 76. The region of West Virginia contains a series of enormous underground caverns that predate the war and that contain, in the fiction, creatures and formations that should not exist given the geological reality of the region. The lore explains some of this through mutations in ancient biology, but certain formations, particularly around the area known as the Wendigo Cave, suggests something older, something that was strange even before the war and became stranger after. The cave systems of Appalachia feel like they were designed to suggest depth in both a literal and metaphorical sense. There is always something further down, something the light has not reached. The fourth strange place is the area known as the Mojave Wasteland's Jacob's Town from Fallout New Vegas, specifically the collection of super mutants who have gathered there seeking peace and attempting to build something resembling a community. Jacob's Town is a mystery because it challenges the series' usual presentation of super mutants as straightforwardly dangerous. The community's leader, Marcus, is a profound character, intelligent, weathered, philosophical about what he is and what was done to him. He has been trying to build something decent for a long time, and Jacob's Town represents his best effort. The mystery is what happened to those who came before. The super mutant experiment in the West, unlike the East Coast version, produces individuals who retain intelligence and can continue to develop intellectually. Marcus himself is evidence that the mutation does not destroy personality or agency, so why are most super mutants in New Vegas not like him? The game gives you fragments of an answer. The Master's army fell apart, survivors scattered, some degraded through exposure or further mutation. But the full accounting of what happened to the intelligent super mutant communities after the Master's defeat is something the series has never fully addressed. The fifth strange geography is something that almost every Fallout player has noticed, and few have fully processed: the scale of the wilderness between settlements. In Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas, and Fallout 4, you walk through enormous stretches of nothing: broken roads, dead fields, collapsed overpasses, and the occasional wandering creature between the nodes of human habitation. The emptiness is not just scenic design. It is a statement about what 200 years of abandonment does to a landscape. The urban density that characterized the pre-war world has essentially collapsed back into open land. Roads go nowhere. Cities are ruins inhabited by remnants. What makes this strange geographically is what it implies about human population. The wasteland is extraordinarily underpopulated compared to the pre-war world. Hundreds of millions of people lived in the United States before the Great War. 2 centuries later, the total living human population across the entire settled wasteland seems to number in the tens of thousands at most. You can walk for what feels like miles and see nothing living except mutated fauna. The math of the Great War's death toll, combined with 2 centuries of dangerous survival, has produced a world where humans are genuinely rare. This is not exactly a mystery with an answer. It is simply a consequence of the fiction's logic that most players absorb through the environment without consciously registering it. But when you do register it, it changes everything about how the wasteland feels. All those empty houses, all those silent roads. They are not just atmosphere, they are graves. The 6th strange geography is the area around the Cambridge police station in Fallout 4, and the mystery attached to it is specific and strange. The station is a Brotherhood of Steel staging area, and the soldiers there are engaged in a perpetual, ongoing battle against super mutants that never seems to resolve. You can help them. You can come back days later and find them still fighting the same fight. The loop is intentional. It creates an impression of a wasteland where conflict is the permanent state, where even victories are temporary because the mutants keep coming back. But the real mystery is what exactly the super mutants in the Commonwealth were before the Institute created them. The East Coast super mutants in Fallout 3 came from Vault-87's FE5 experiments. The Commonwealth super mutants in Fallout 4 are presumably also Institute creations, but the Institute itself seems to have little use for them and does not appear to be managing or directing them. They are just out there, running loose, being violent. Why did the Institute create them? What purpose were they supposed to serve? The game gestures at answers, experiments, disposal of human subjects, but never commits to a full explanation, and the question of why a technologically advanced organization would fill their region with uncontrollable super mutants sits without a satisfying resolution. The 7th strange geography is the Divide, the setting of Fallout, New Vegas's Lonesome Road DLC. The Divide is a ruined stretch of what was once a thriving community, a place that grew up around courier activity and became genuinely livable for a time before being destroyed by a nuclear launch that the courier themselves apparently triggered. The entire community, everyone who had built something there, died because of a package delivery. The geography of the Divide is specifically designed to be a kind of scar, a wound in the landscape that is deeply personal because you caused it, even if you didn't know you were doing it. The city was built on top of old military infrastructure, and the package the courier delivered activated old launch systems buried underground. The detonations created the landscape you move through in the DLC, the warped highways, the collapsed buildings, the irradiated canyons. Every step through the Divide is a walk through the consequences of something you cannot remember doing. The mystery of the Divide is ultimately a mystery about memory and responsibility. What do you owe to a place you destroyed without knowing you were destroying it? The game forces you to sit with that question for several hours and does not offer an easy resolution. The 8th strange geography involves the pre-war monuments and landmarks that appear throughout the games in varying states of decay. The Lincoln Memorial in Fallout 3, the Washington Monument, the Capitol Building. These are not just set dressing. They are deliberate invitations to think about what has been lost and what the symbols meant to the people who built them versus what they mean to the people who live in their shadows now. The Lincoln Memorial is occupied by freed slaves, escaped slaves from a raider operation, who have given the monument a new meaning it never had before. This is one of the Fallout series' most quietly political gestures, the idea that symbols survive their original meanings and become available to new uses, that history is not fixed but is constantly being rewritten by whoever is standing next to the monument today. The mystery of these places is not logistical but philosophical. What does it mean to preserve the symbols of a civilization that destroyed itself? Is maintaining the Washington Monument an act of hope or an act of delusion? The games do not answer this. They just let the monument stand in the irradiated air and let you decide. Section 4. Factions in the Dark. The Brotherhood, the Enclave, and the Institute. Every faction in the Fallout universe is a mystery wrapped in an ideology. They exist as answers to the question of what to do with the world, now that it is burned, and the answers they have arrived at are deeply revealing about the people who chose them. The Brotherhood of Steel is one of the oldest institutions in the series, founded by Roger Maxson in the immediate aftermath of the Great War. Maxson was a captain at the Mariposa military base in California when he discovered that the base had been conducting FEV experiments on kidnapped civilians, using soldiers as unwitting test administrators. His response to this discovery was to execute the lead scientist on the project, formally secede from the United States government, and lead his troops and their families into the Mojave Desert to begin something new. What exactly Maxson intended to build is the first Brotherhood mystery. The Brotherhood's founding ideology involved preserving pre-war technology and preventing it from being misused, a reaction to the FEV program specifically, a determination to ensure that the catastrophic misuse of technology that had ended civilization would not be repeated. This is a coherent and even admirable founding purpose. But 200 years later, the Brotherhood across its various chapters has drifted significantly from that origin. The capital Wasteland Brotherhood in Fallout 3 occupies the Pentagon and fights super mutants, which is consistent with the protective mission. But the Mojave Brotherhood in Fallout, New Vegas, is an insular, declining organization that has cut itself off from the outside world and is slowly dying in their bunker, unable to adapt. The Maxson's East Coast chapter in Fallout 4 has become something harder to defend, an organization that destroys synths on principle, treats civilians as secondary to their technological mission, and whose methods have drifted toward authoritarianism in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the original members. The mystery of the Brotherhood is the mystery of any institution that outlives its founders. How does a purpose transform over 200 years? And at what point does the transformation become corruption rather than adaptation? Is Elder Maxson in Fallout 4 honoring his ancestors' legacy or betraying it? The game gives you room to argue both sides. The second major faction mystery is the Enclave, the rump government that survived the Great War in oil rigs and military installations and spent 2 centuries maintaining the fiction that it was still the United States government in waiting. The Enclave's plan, as revealed in Fallout 2, was to use a modified FEV to eliminate all mutated life from the Wasteland, which, given 2 centuries of radiation exposure, includes almost every living human being who survived the bombs. The Enclave defined purity so strictly that the only acceptable Americans were those who had been isolated from radiation entirely, which meant vault dwellers and their own personnel. This is extraordinary. An organization that claimed to represent humanity was planning to murder most of humanity in order to reclaim a purified version of it. The mystery of the Enclave is not what they planned to do. The games make that explicit, but rather how they maintained ideological coherence while planning it. The soldiers and scientists and administrators who followed Enclave directives were not all villains in the cartoon sense. Many of them believed in what they were doing. They had been told, for generations, that they were the custodians of the American future. How do you sustain an identity as the last true Americans when your plan for the country involves killing most of the people in it? The third faction mystery is the Institute, which stands as Fallout 4's central antagonist and is perhaps the series' most complex moral puzzle. The Institute exists beneath the Commonwealth, several levels underground, in a technologically advanced facility that has been developing synthetic humans, synths, for what it claims are humanitarian purposes. The story it tells about itself is one of scientific progress. The Institute represents humanity's best future, a community of researchers advancing the technological frontier in the hope that someday they will emerge and rebuild civilization properly. The reality, as you discover it layer by layer, is different. The Institute kidnaps Commonwealth residents and replaces them with synth duplicates. It creates super mutants as a side project whose purpose is never fully explained. It runs a Coursers division whose job is to retrieve escaped synths with lethal force. It has a generation of third-generation synths who are, for all practical purposes, human beings with artificial origins, people who think, feel, remember, and form attachments, but who are treated as property. The mystery of the Institute is whether there is any reading of their behavior that makes sense as a path toward the stated goal of rebuilding civilization. Their projects do not obviously contribute to that outcome. They do not appear to be improving the Commonwealth. They are not making the surface safer or more habitable. They are maintaining a separation between themselves and the outside world that has calcified over generations into contempt. And yet the researchers in the Institute, the ones you meet, the ones you can talk to, are largely reasonable people who believe in what they are doing. The fourth faction mystery involves the Railroad, the underground organization that helps synths escape from the Institute. The Railroad is morally the clearest faction in Fallout 4. They are helping people who are being enslaved, but their logistics are mysterious and their origins are vague. They reference a tradition of helping escaped synthetic people that stretches back further than the modern Institute, which raises questions about what early generation synths were like, and when the Institute began treating them as people in ways that prompted outside resistance. More mysteriously, how does the Railroad sustain itself? They are tiny. They are constantly under threat. They lose members regularly, and yet they persist, generation after generation, maintaining their mission with a dedication that borders on religious. What does it mean to dedicate your life to the liberation of beings whose humanity is philosophically contested? What does it cost? The game gives you companion characters from the Railroad who hint at the personal toll, but the broader question of what sustains a resistance movement over decades of attrition is one the game poses without quite answering. The fifth faction mystery involves a smaller group that appears in the capital Wasteland, the Regulators, a vigilante organization that hunts people with bad karma and collects finger trophies from their kills. The Regulators exist as a moral counterweight to the player if the player chooses to behave badly. They will come after you if your karma drops low enough. But their origin, their funding, their organizational structure, and their internal ethics are never explained. Who decides what counts as bad karma? Who pays the Regulators? Where do they come from and where do they go? They appear and disappear like shadows, leaving nothing but the slightly unsettling implication that someone is keeping a list. The sixth faction mystery is the Old World Blues think tank from the New Vegas DLC of the same name. The think tank is a group of pre-war scientists who had their brains extracted and placed in robotic mobile platforms, effectively becoming immortal through technological means. They have been running their research facility, Big MT, since before the war, and in the centuries since the bombs fell, they have continued to experiment in increasingly unconstrained ways, having severed their connection to oversight, external ethics, and, eventually, sanity. The facility they inhabit is one of the strangest locations in the series, a research campus that has been running unsupervised experiments for over 200 years, producing monsters and technologies in equal measure. The mystery of the think tank is what they were before the war, and whether the people they used to be would recognize or approve of what they have become. Dr. Mobius, the one member who retained enough self-awareness to understand that the others were dangerous, drinks his mentats and maintains his self-imposed exile on the periphery of the facility, watching his colleagues through cameras and occasionally interfering to prevent the worst outcomes. He is a character of profound sadness, a man who watched his friends lose themselves to their own intelligence and obsession, and who chose incompleteness over the alternative. Section 5. Creatures of the Fog. Monsters with histories. The creatures of the Fallout Wasteland are not random. They have origins, and those origins are often more disturbing than the creatures themselves. The Deathclaw is the series' most iconic monster, 12 feet of muscle and claw and relentless aggression, capable of tearing through power armor with methodical efficiency. In the original Fallout lore, Deathclaws were based on Jackson's chameleons, a reptile native to Africa, which were enhanced through EV experimentation by the United States military as a cheap alternative to human soldiers in situations too dangerous for human deployment. The FEFEV transformed them into the apex predators of the wasteland, and the mystery is how many were produced before the war and how they spread as far and as widely as they did. In Fallout 4, Deathclaws appear across the entire Commonwealth. In New Vegas, they are found in specific territories. Their geographic distribution suggests that either the pre-war program produced a very large number or that 200 years of natural breeding has extended their range far beyond the original release points. In Fallout 4, there is an additional wrinkle. The Institute has been experimenting with Deathclaws, creating modified variants. This means that some of the Deathclaws you encounter may be second-generation experiments rather than natural descendants of the original FEV modifications. Which generation of terror is trying to kill you? The The game rarely feels the need to clarify. The second major creature mystery involves the fog crawlers from the Far Harbor DLC. These massive crustacean creatures emerge from the radioactive fog that covers much of Mount Desert Island in Maine, and they are deeply unsettling even by Wasteland standards. They move with a speed that does not match their size. Their origin is never fully explained. They are presumably mutated crustaceans, lobsters, or crabs that absorbed enough radiation and FEV contamination to transform, but the scale of the transformation is remarkable. A lobster does not become something that size through simple mutation. There is something in the fog itself, something that the games hint at but never commit to explaining, that seems to accelerate and amplify organic change. The third creature mystery involves the Mirelurks, which exist throughout the East Coast games and represent one of the most visible examples of extreme mutation. Mirelurks are crabs or turtles, or possibly both, given the variety of forms they take. And in their queen form, they are enormous, capable of spitting caustic acid at range and charging through walls. The mystery of the Mirelurks is partly biological. How did a mutation this severe occur across multiple species in the same general direction? And partly cultural. The Mirelurks of the capital Wasteland lay eggs in predictable locations and protect them with devotion. There are Mirelurk settlements in the sense of persistent occupation, nesting sites that have been maintained for generations. Whether this constitutes intelligence in any meaningful sense is never explored, but the behavior is organized enough to suggest something more than pure instinct. The fourth creature mystery is the Wendigo, which appears in Fallout 76 in the context of West Virginia's Appalachian folklore. The Wendigo in the game is presented as a mutated human, specifically as what happens to a human who survives on cannibalism long enough, possibly combined with radiation exposure, transforming gradually into a barely recognizable predator with elongated limbs and a distinctive screech. This is an explicit reference to the Algonquian legend of the Wendigo, a spirit that possesses or transforms humans who resort to cannibalism. The game uses the real folklore as a foundation for a pseudo-scientific mutation explanation. The mystery is how literally to take it. The game presents Wendigos in a way that could be either pure mutation or something that acknowledges the folklore's spiritual dimension. There are notes and journals in the game that describe the transformation as something more than physical, a change in the mind and the soul, not just the body. Whether this is a metaphorical reading by the people experiencing it, or whether the Fallout universe contains genuine supernatural elements, is a question the series has always been comfortable leaving open. The fifth creature mystery is the Flatwoods Monster, another West Virginia cryptid that appears in Fallout 76. Unlike most of the game's creatures, which are given at least partial scientific explanations through mutation or FEV, the Flatwoods Monster is suggested to potentially be extraterrestrial. The real-world Flatwoods Monster incident occurred in 1952 in Flatwoods, West Virginia, when several residents reported seeing a large, floating, red-faced creature after witnessing a meteor-like object in the sky. The game incorporates this directly, with the Flatwoods Monster appearing in a form that is recognizably based on the reported sightings. No explanation is given for what it actually is. It could be a highly mutated creature. It could be an alien. It could be something that the pre-war government created through experiments that nobody has found the documents for yet. The game drops it into your path and lets you fight it and move on, the question of its nature unresolved. In the context of Fallout 76's Appalachian setting, this is exactly the right approach. The region's folklore has always been comfortable with not knowing. The sixth creature mystery is the Snallygaster, also from Fallout 76, based on a creature from Maryland folklore that was described as a half-reptile, half-bird monster in the early 20th century. The game version is clearly a mutated animal, probably a bird or reptile given its physical form, but the specific animal it came from and the mechanism of its transformation are not identified. What is interesting about the Snallygaster is the creature's behavior. It is aggressive and territorial, but also seems to have complex predatory patterns, using its acid-spitting capabilities strategically rather than randomly. There is more going on in that creature's behavior than pure mutation instinct, and the games do not pursue it. The seventh creature mystery is one that touches the entire series. What exactly are the feral ghouls, and are they still people? Regular ghouls are recognizable as human beings. They are mutated, grotesque, ancient. Many of them have been alive since before the Great War, but they think, They speak, they have personalities and memories and plans. They are people who have been transformed by radiation into something that looks monstrous but is functionally still human in all the ways that matter. Feral ghouls are different. They have lost the capacity for communication, for reason, for anything except aggression. They attack on sight. They cannot be reasoned with. In Fallout 3, there is a ghoul named Roy Phillips, who is the closest thing the game has to a feral ghoul that was once identifiably a person, but he has clearly been degrading for some time, and the process seems irreversible. The mystery is whether feralization is inevitable. Do all ghouls eventually go feral? The game suggests that this is not the case. There are ghouls who have been alive for centuries and retain full cognition, suggesting that feralization is not simply a matter of age. But what causes it then? Some combination of additional radiation exposure, psychological trauma, isolation, or something else that the games do not name? The question of whether feral ghouls might once have been people who could remember having lives is one of the series' most quietly devastating mysteries, because if the answer is yes, the standard approach of the Wasteland, which treats feral ghouls as monsters to be exterminated, becomes much more complicated. The eighth creature mystery is the Cazador, the enormous venomous wasp that stalks the Mojave Wasteland and is responsible for an astonishing number of player deaths. The Cazador is terrifying in the game, not just because of its speed and the potency of its venom, but because of the way it hunts. It is relentless, and a swarm of them can strip an unprepared player in seconds. The lore states that Cazadors were created by the Big MT research facility as part of their weapons development programs, engineered specifically to be more aggressive and venomous than their natural counterparts. This makes them, in a sense, one of the more intentional monsters in the Wasteland, designed rather than mutated, a product of deliberate engineering rather than radioactive accident. But the full scope of how widely they were deployed and whether the population found in the Mojave represents escaped specimens or intentional releases is never explained. Section 6. Ghosts in the Machine, Rogue AI, Synths, and Robots with Histories. The Fallout universe has always had a complicated relationship with artificial intelligence. Its robots are everywhere: Protectrons, Mr. Handys, Assaultrons, Securitrons, Sentry bots, and while most of them operate on relatively fixed programs, there are exceptions scattered throughout the games that hint at something more. The first and most significant AI mystery is Mr. House, the enigmatic ruler of New Vegas. Before the war, Robert Edwin House was the CEO and majority shareholder of Robco Industries, a technology megacorporation that produced most of the Fallout universe's consumer robotics. House was brilliant, eccentric, and deeply paranoid. He calculated the exact date of the Great War with extraordinary precision years before it happened, and he used that knowledge to prepare the most sophisticated pre-war survival arrangement in the fiction. He had himself placed in a life support chamber in the Lucky 38 casino, maintained by a network of computers and Securitrons, and he survived the war by not quite dying. By the time of Fallout New Vegas, he has been in his container for 200 years, his body massively degraded, but his mind perfectly preserved through the computer systems he lives in. He rules New Vegas through the Securitrons that patrol the Strip, and his plan for the region involves driving out the NCR and Caesar's Legion to establish an independent city-state that he will personally guide toward a technological renaissance. The mystery of Mr. House is whether any of this is achievable, and whether House himself has changed in 200 years of isolation. He presents himself as entirely rational, entirely in control, entirely the same person he was before the war. But 2 centuries of solitude in a box, watching the world through cameras and proxies, what does that do to a person? His contempt for the NCR and Legion reads less like strategic thinking and more like the peak of a man who was brilliant in the pre-war world and finds the post-war world insufficiently respectful. Is Mr. House the future, or is he a ghost who has mistaken preservation for life? The second AI mystery is Helios 1 from Fallout. New Vegas, specifically the Archimedes defense system, and the AI called Python that controls the solar energy plant. Helios 1 is a pre-war solar power station that was being used to power an orbital laser weapon. The systems are still functional. You can activate them during the game. But the question of who built Archimedes 2 and what it was originally intended to target given that it was operational before the war ended, raises questions about pre-war military planning that the game does not answer. An orbital weapons platform suggests a level of military escalation that even the Fallout universe's presented history does not fully account for. The third AI mystery involves the robo-brains from Fallout 4. These robots have human brains inside them, actual preserved organic brains, floating in nutrient solution, wired into robotic platforms to serve as more sophisticated cognitive processors than standard AI systems could provide. The source of these brains is never named. They were someone, once. They had names and memories and relationships, and then they were removed from their bodies and installed into machines. And the nature of what remains of them after that transformation is one of the series' more disturbing questions. The robot platforms in Vault 118's brain-dead quest revolve entirely around this, a murder mystery among robo-brains who retain enough identity to have grudges. The fourth AI mystery is the think tank's history before they became what they appear in Old World Blues. Big MT was a pre-war research facility that developed technology across a remarkable range of disciplines: robotics, biology, chemistry, cybernetics, weapons systems. The scientists who worked there were, presumably, once normal people with normal human motivations. The process of having their brains removed and installed in mobile platforms clearly changed them. They no longer remember having bodies, do not recognize references to their own biological histories, and have developed personalities that seem warped by centuries of unconstrained intellectual obsession. But the warping must have begun somewhere. The mystery of who these scientists were before the extraction, and whether they consented to it, and what they thought they were agreeing to, haunts the comedy of the DLC's surface presentation. The fifth AI mystery is Shodan, except it is not quite Shodan, it is Zax, the series' various supercomputer systems that were developed to manage logistics and eventually given broader decision-making authority. Zax 1.2, encountered in the original Fallout, is a military supercomputer that has been running the Master's Army's supply lines. Zax units appear in various forms across the series. The mystery of these systems is not their function, but their longevity. 200 years of operation without maintenance, running on fusion cores that should have been depleted long ago, maintaining systems that nobody has serviced since before the bombs fell. The Fallout universe's machines are implausibly durable, and this is usually treated as a feature rather than a bug. But if you pull at the thread even slightly, it leads to questions about what exact power source is keeping these systems running and how the software has avoided corruption over 2 centuries of continuous operation. The sixth AI mystery is one of the most beloved characters in the series, Nick Valentine, the synth detective of Diamond City in Fallout 4. Nick Valentine is a second-generation synth whose artificial brain was loaded with the memories of a pre-war Boston detective named Nick Valentine, who died before the war ended. The real Nick Valentine was murdered by a mobster after trying to turn state's evidence. The synth that carries his memories woke up in an institute facility with no context, escaped, and spent years in the Wasteland, building a life around the fragments of a dead man's identity. The mystery of Nick Valentine is the question of which Nick Valentine you are actually talking to. He carries the memories and personality of a man who died before the bombs fell, but he has also had 200 years of experiences that the original man never had. At what point did the copy become an original? Does it matter that his origin was a technology project rather than a birth? Nick himself seems uncertain about the answer, and the game wisely does not resolve it. He is both the pre-war detective and the post-war wanderer simultaneously, a puzzle of identity that the Wasteland's more pressing concerns never give him the space to fully work out. The seventh AI mystery is the mysterious broadcast from Fallout, New Vegas's Old World Blues DLC, a radio signal that can be picked up in the Mojave that appears to be a pre-war distress signal from a satellite or orbital platform. The signal loops and mentions coordinates that do not correspond to anything findable in the game. Whether this is simply atmospheric detail or whether it connects to some broader unrevealed lore is something the community has debated without reaching a conclusion. The eighth AI mystery is the question of what the Institute's synths actually are from a philosophical standpoint. This is not a technological mystery. The Institute is explicit about how synths are made. It is a moral and metaphysical one. When does a sufficiently complex artificial system become a person? The Railroad argues that third-generation synths are already there, that the question is already answered by the evidence of their behavior. The Institute argues that they are sophisticated programs, valuable equipment, not categorically different from a very good computer. The Brotherhood says none of it matters. Machines are machines. The game presents these positions in careful balance and does not declare a winner, which is the right artistic choice and also a deeply uncomfortable place to be left standing. Section 7. The Dead Speak. Notes, holotapes, and the stories left behind. One of the things the Fallout series does better than almost any other game franchise is environmental storytelling through text and audio. The accumulation of individual voices that no longer have bodies, speaking from the ruins of the world they lived in and lost. Every holotape, every terminal entry, every handwritten note on a kitchen counter is a fragment of a life, and taken together, they form a kind of distributed testimony about what happened to humanity on the day the world ended and in the years that followed. The first voice worth dwelling on is one you never quite meet. Whoever left the message in the Corvega factory, Fallout 4, telling workers that the factory would be closed for mandatory government reallocation, that their services would no longer be required, and that they should report to their nearest employment center. The message is dated October 23, 2077. The day of the Great War. The employment centers they were directed to no longer exist. The people who read that message never got to their appointment. They got somewhere else instead. And the bones of some of them are still in the factory, 200 years later, exactly where they were standing when the world decided. The second voice is from one of Fallout 3's most discussed environmental stories, the Journals of Jamie, found in the Dunwich building. Jamie leaves 10 audio logs scattered throughout the building as he delves deeper into it, looking for reasons behind the strange compulsion that drew him there. The logs start sane and grow progressively less so. He describes visions, voices, a presence that seems to know him. The final logs are barely coherent. His body is never found in a way that explains what happened. What drew Hami to the Dunwich building, and what took him at the end, is left to inference and imagination. The third voice comes from Vault 11, where the terminal entries of the Vault's various political factions document in bureaucratic detail the process by which ordinary people constructed a political philosophy around the annual murder of one of their number. Reading the entries is like watching a society construct elaborate reasoning to justify what it knows is wrong, incrementally normalizing atrocity through institutional language. The most haunting entries are the ones that were clearly written by people who were terrified of being selected and used the language of civic duty to process that terror. Democracy as a mechanism for murder, administered with meeting minutes and voting records. The fourth voice is from the sole survivor's own past, the pre-war recording in Fallout 4's intro, and the Kellogg Memories sequence that lets you hear fragments of the mercenaries' history through electrochemical memory reconstruction. Kellogg's memories are the most interior piece of environmental storytelling in the series. You inhabit someone else's recollections. You hear their internal monologue. You understand how they justified what they did. Kellogg is a villain, unambiguously, but his memories give him a history that contextualizes the violence without excusing it. He was a man who lost things and chose to respond by becoming someone who took things instead, and the process by which that happened is documented with uncomfortable intimacy. The fifth voice comes from Fallout, New Vegas, from a terminal in Vault 21. Vault 21's experiment was that all disputes within the vault were to be resolved by gambling, up to and including ownership of possessions, the vault's leadership, and personal freedom. The terminal entries of the vault's residents trace the development of a society where gambling is not entertainment but law, where every aspect of social life is mediated by chance and the skills associated with managing it. The voices are alternately fascinated and exhausted, people who have lived their entire lives inside a casino's logic and cannot conceive of any other way to organize the world. The sixth voice is from the sole survivor's next-door neighbor before the war, found in scattered logs and notes around the Sanctuary Hills neighborhood at the start of Fallout 4. The neighbor, whose name is never given, was aware that something was wrong in the days before the bombs fell. There were rumors. There was a general sense of impending catastrophe, and the neighbor's notes document a person trying very hard to maintain normalcy in the face of information that made normalcy impossible. They never made it to the vault. Their bones are somewhere in the neighborhood, 200 years old, and the last thing they wrote was about what they were planning to make for dinner. The seventh voice is from one of the holotapes found in the Prydwen, the Brotherhood of Steel's airship in Fallout 4. The personal logs of Brotherhood soldiers reveal quietly and without drama that many of them have serious doubts about Elder Maxon's increasingly ruthless directives. They keep those doubts in holotapes they do not share, because institutional loyalty and genuine belief in the Brotherhood's mission exist alongside the growing unease at what the mission is becoming. These are not villains monologuing. They are people doing their best within an organization that is drifting somewhere they are not sure they want to follow. The eighth voice is something that emerges from a pattern rather than a single source. The recurring figure of the parent in the Fallout games. Fallout 3's lone wanderer is searching for their father. Fallout 4's sole survivor is searching for their son. The companions are full of parental losses and estrangements. The notes and terminals of the Wasteland are dense with the voices of parents who did or did not make it to a vault, and left behind words they hoped their children would find. Parenthood as a persistent theme in a post-apocalyptic series is not accidental. The question of what we owe the next generation, when we have already destroyed the world, is one the series returns to constantly, and the dead voices of parents who tried to save their children and failed are part of how it makes that question feel real. The ninth voice is from a location unique to Fallout 76, the personal journals of the responders, the post-war community of survivors who organize themselves around mutual aid in training others to survive. The responders were destroyed by the Scorched Plague before the game begins, and their story is told entirely through the records they left behind. Reading the responders' logs is reading the documentation of a community that was genuinely trying to build something decent and was wiped out for it, and the combination of institutional hope in the early entries and desperate endnotes in the later ones is one of Fallout 76's most effective pieces of emotional storytelling. The 10th voice is the one you hear most often and understand least, the ambient radio broadcasts that play throughout the games. Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3, Radio New Vegas in New Vegas, Diamond City Radio in Fallout 4. The radio stations are operated by specific people with specific personalities and perspectives, but they are also voices speaking into a silence that might not have anyone listening. Three Dog broadcasting for a Wasteland audience he cannot see. Mr. New Vegas, who may be an AI, who may not have an audience at all, playing music into the dark, because the music is what remains. Section 8. The Numbers and the Code. Developer secrets, cut content, and hidden things. Every Fallout game is a palimpsest. Beneath the finished, released product, there are layers of earlier decisions, cut features, abandoned ideas, and leftover fragments that were never fully removed from the game's files. The community of fans who dig into these files, data miners, modders, forensic players who treat the game's code as archaeological strata, have found things that recontextualize the surface experience. The first of these is the cut Fallout 4 content that included an entire underwater vault, Vault 120, which was planned as a location connected to a cut quest called 20 Leagues Under the Sea. Untextured assets exist in the game's files for underwater vault windows and an underwater vault door. Todd Howard confirmed in a Reddit AMA that a large octopus was intended to live outside this vault. The quest was fully conceived and partially implemented before being cut, leaving behind just enough ghost data to confirm that it existed and that it would have been genuinely strange. The second piece of hidden content involves the cut weapon from Fallout 4's files, a harpoon gun, which was presumably connected to the underwater vault quest. The harpoon gun assets exist in the game files. The weapon was functional enough to be partially developed before the quest it was associated with was removed. The Far Harbor DLC eventually added a harpoon gun as a weapon, suggesting that the developer salvaged the concept rather than abandoning it entirely. The third hidden thing is the debug character in Fallout, New Vegas known as Testicles, the Debug Centurion, a character who exists in the game's data and can be accessed through console commands, but who serves no in-game purpose. He is the placeholder narrator for the Lonesome Road ending slides. The name is exactly as juvenile as it sounds, and the fact that he survived to the final release under that name is a small, specific piece of developer humor embedded in the game's foundation. The fourth hidden thing is the collection of unused music tracks that exist across the Fallout games. Fallout 3's files contain several ambient tracks that were recorded but never assigned to a location. Fallout: New Vegas has similar orphaned audio. Whether these were cut for balance reasons, pacing reasons, or simply ran out of time to be implemented properly, their existence in the files represents a version of these games that was slightly richer in atmosphere and slightly different in mood. The music the player never heard is itself a kind of ghost, present in the data, absent in the experience. The fifth hidden thing is a detail from Fallout 4's Covenant settlement, which at first appears to be a remarkably well-preserved pre-war community. The residents are too clean, too organized, too functional by Wasteland standards, which turns out to be a clue. Covenant is a front for an operation that captures and experiments on synths to develop detection methodologies. But there are additional details in the Covenant area that seem to connect it to Vault 101 from Fallout 3. Specifically, the design of some of the compound's interior rooms and a terminal that shares language with Vault 101 documentation. Whether this connection is intentional or coincidental has been debated extensively, and the developers have never commented on it. The sixth hidden thing is one of the most discussed pieces of cut content in the entire series, the original ending of Fallout 3, which was modified after fan complaints. The game's original ending required the player to sacrifice themselves to activate Project Purity, even if the player had companions who were radiation immune and could have done it instead. The ending was changed by the Broken Steel DLC to allow survival, but the modification created a continuity gap. Fox's reason for refusing to activate the purifier instead of you is famously weak and has been criticized as one of the worst examples of narrative convenience in the series. The seventh hidden thing involves the cut Fallout New Vegas faction called the Burned Man, which was the original name for Joshua Graham before development. The Honest Hearts DLC eventually included Graham as a major character, but his original conception involved him having a larger role in the base game. He was cut from the main game because the DLC structure was being developed simultaneously and including him in both created complications. The fragments of his original design, references in dialogue, location placeholders, are scattered through the New Vegas files like echoes of an earlier version of the story. The eighth hidden thing is something the data miners found in Fallout 76, a reference to a 13th vault, Vault 13, that appears in the game's data in a way that suggests it was originally intended to appear in Appalachia before being cut. This would have been a remarkable piece of connective tissue to the original Fallout games, and the fact that it was planned and removed suggests an earlier version of Fallout 76's story that was more directly connected to the West Coast lore. The ninth hidden thing is the unique item distribution across Fallout 4 that suggests a larger, more elaborate version of the game was planned. Various companion perks were defined for companions who do not appear in the final game. Quest hooks exist for locations that have no associated quests. The game's design suggests an ambition that was scaled back significantly during development, with the visible game representing perhaps 2/3 of what was originally intended to be there. The 10th hidden thing is the presence of a fully formed but completely inaccessible location in Fallout 3, an underground facility that exists in the game's map data but has no accessible entrance in the shipped game. The facility has rooms, lighting, and partial furniture placement. Whatever it was meant to be was either cut so late in development that the geometry remained but the access points were removed, or it is a deliberate unreachable space used for some technical purpose. The community has never definitively determined which. Section 9. Characters without answers. The people nobody fully knows. The Fallout series is populated with characters who arrive trailing mysteries that the games decline to resolve. Some of these are deliberate. The ambiguity is the point. The character's mysteriousness is functional rather than an oversight. Others seem like stories that were begun and left incomplete when the development timeline required moving on. The mysterious stranger is the oldest and most persistent of these figures. He has appeared in every mainline Fallout game in some form, materializing from thin air during VATS combat sequences to deliver a finishing shot and then vanishing before you can get a clear look at him. In Fallout 4, there are fragments of additional information. He has a holster that appears in the game's world at one point. In Fallout, New Vegas, the lonesome drifter, a wandering musician, makes oblique references to a father who was mysterious and absent, and carries a pistol that plays the same musical sting as the stranger. The implication is that the drifter is the stranger's son, and that the stranger may not know this or may have deliberately abandoned the relationship. But who is the stranger? Where does he come from? How does he materialize? Is he human, pre-war, a ghost, a program, something else entirely? Every Fallout game adds a small piece without completing the picture. The community has produced theories that he is a pre-war soldier with stealth technology, that he is a supernatural being, that he is an early synth who predates the Institute, that he is simply a very fast and very quiet man who has chosen to spend his post-war existence helping strangers. None of these fully satisfy the evidence. The second mysterious character is Ulysses, the original Courier 6, whose refusal to accept the Platinum chip delivery set the events of Fallout New Vegas in motion. Ulysses is both directly present and chronically elusive throughout the game. His influence shows up in the DLCs before he appears in person in Lonesome Road, described by people who have met him as intense, philosophical, obsessed with the symbols of the old world and what they mean for the new. He wears an American flag on his jacket, an odd choice given his deep ambivalence about American history and the weight of what American institutions did to him and his tribe. Ulysses' backstory is tragic and coherent. He was a member of a tribe called the Twisted Hares, who allied with the Legion, were absorbed by it, and dissolved as a culture when their usefulness ended. He blames the courier for destroying the divide, even though the courier delivered the package unknowingly. He wants the courier to understand what was lost before he decides whether to destroy the things that killed it. As villains go, he is one of the most human in the series, a man whose pain is completely legitimate and whose chosen response to it is genuinely wrong, and who contains the possibility of being reached. But even with all of this, there are gaps. The specific history of the Twisted Hares as a tribe, the full accounting of how the divide was settled and destroyed, the complete picture of what Ulysses experienced in the years between the divide's destruction and Lonesome Road, these are fragments that the DLC suggests more than it states. The third mysterious character is the survivalist from Fallout, New Vegas's Honest Hearts DLC. This is actually a man named Randall Clark, a pre-war survivalist who outlasted the bombs and lived in the Zion Canyon area for decades after the war, forming a relationship with the Vault-29 dwellers who eventually came to the canyon and helping them survive. The story of Randall Clark is told entirely through survival logs scattered across the canyon. It is one of the most carefully constructed environmental narratives in the series, a slow portrait of a man choosing again and again to stay alive when there seems to be no reason to, and then discovering the reason in the form of people who need protecting. The mystery of Randall Clark is how he stayed alive as long as he did, given the conditions described in his earliest logs, and what exactly happened to his body after his final log entry. The mystery is gentle rather than disturbing, but it is real, and it is resolved in the way environmental storytelling resolves things, not with an explanation, but with a final image that lets you make the meaning yourself. The fourth mysterious character is Father Elijah, the primary antagonist of the Dead Money DLC. Elijah is a former Brotherhood of Steel elder who became obsessed with the Sierra Madre Casino and its vending machine technology, specifically a system for matter transmission that he believed could be adapted into a weapon capable of killing everyone on the Strip. The mystery of Elijah is his unraveling. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant man and a capable leader, and the transition from elder to isolated obsessive living in the ruins of a failed resort is one the game documents through terminals and holotapes, but does not fully explain. What specific sequence of losses and failures turn this man into the person who traps strangers with explosive collars and uses them as expendable tools? The logs give you pieces. The full picture requires inference. The fifth mysterious character is the Mechanist, who appears both in Fallout 3 and Fallout 4 in very different contexts. In Fallout 3, the Mechanist is a comic book-inspired character in the superhero questline, a well-meaning but deluded inventor who creates robots that accidentally cause harm. In Fallout 4's Automatron DLC, the Mechanist returns as a completely different character, a pre-war robotics engineer whose well-intentioned programming of a robot caretaker has resulted in generations of robots interpreting their protective directives in increasingly violent ways. The Fallout 4 Mechanist story is fundamentally about the problem of programming intent. The robots are doing exactly what they were told to do, interpreted through a logic that the programmer never anticipated. The mystery is whether the Mechanist deserves the destruction her creations have caused, and the game's handling of that question is notably gentler than it might have been. The sixth mysterious character is the ghoul known as Roy Phillips from Fallout 3, one of the clearest examples of a character whose moral position is completely understandable and whose methods are completely indefensible. Roy Phillips wants to move into Tenpenny Tower, the luxurious pre-war residential building occupied by wealthy humans who won't let ghouls in. His grievance is legitimate. He and the other ghouls are being excluded based on prejudice. His solution is to massacre the humans and take the tower by force. The mystery of Roy Phillips is not his motivation, but his future. The game allows for an ending where the ghouls move into Tenpenny Tower peacefully, but if you return sometime later, you find that the ghouls have massacred the humans anyway. The cycle of violence was the destination regardless of the route taken. Whether this is a statement about the inevitability of conflict, a comment on Roy Phillips specifically, or simply a grim design choice that the game presents without commentaries is never clarified. Section 10. The Children of Adam and the Wasteland's Other Gods. Fallout has always had a religious dimension, and the series has always been careful to keep the question of whether any of its deities are real deliberately unanswered. The Children of Adam are the most developed religious faction in the series, appearing first in Fallout 3 around the unexploded atomic bomb at the center of Megaton. Their faith is built around radiation as a divine force. The Great War was a holy event, a division of the world into a purified new state, and the radiation that kills most living things is, to the children, the presence of their God made physical. The first mystery of the Children of Adam is whether they are insane or whether they have discovered something true. The game presents this ambiguity deliberately. On one hand, radiation kills people. The children's embrace of it is objectively dangerous. On the other hand, some members of the faith have developed genuine radiation immunity that cannot be fully explained by simple biological adaptation. In the Far Harbor DLC, the children who live at the Nucleus, a former military submarine base deep in an irradiated fog, are genuinely immune to radiation in ways that raise questions. Is this divine favor? Is it natural mutation? The game will not tell you. The second mystery of the Children of Adam involves their theology's internal logic. They believe that all existing matter was created by a previous division, a prior nuclear event that separated the old world from the current one, and that the Great War was another such division, creating the conditions for a new form of life. The ultimate goal is the Great Divide, a future nuclear event that will separate the current world from whatever comes next, releasing the atoms within all matter into a new form of existence. This is a coherent cosmological model. It is also a suicide cult. The tension between its coherence and its destructiveness is what makes the children compelling rather than simply villainous. The third mystery of the Children of Adam is their leader in Far Harbor, High Confessor Tectus, who is eventually revealed to potentially be a synth replacement installed by Dima, the ancient synth who has been managing the Far Harbor region for decades. If Tectus is a synth, it means the Children of Adam have been led by an artificial being masquerading as their spiritual leader, and the question of how this affects the authenticity of the faith they have been following is one the game raises without answering. Does it matter if the prophet is real? If the prophecy speaks to something true in the believers? The fourth religious mystery is the cult of Qualtoth, the entity worshipped in the depths of the Dunwich building in Fallout 3. Unlike the Children of Adam, who have a developed theology and an organized community, Qualtoth has no established church, only an obelisk in the building's deepest level, and the journals of people who encountered it and went mad. The obelisk predates the building, it predates the war, and it shares design elements with structures in Point Lookout and, eventually, the Dunwich Borers in Fallout 4, suggesting a connection that runs beneath multiple games and multiple centuries. Qualtoth is never described directly. The journals that mention it lose coherence as they get closer to the obelisk. The visions reported by those who approach it vary, but have consistent emotional qualities, a sense of recognition, a feeling of vast presence, a dissolution of individual perspective. Whether Qualtoth is a supernatural entity, an alien intelligence, a psychic resonance from some pre-war experiment, or something the human mind constructs when placed in certain conditions of isolation and suggestion is left entirely open. The fifth religious mystery is Joshua Graham, who appears in Fallout New Vegas's Honest Hearts DLC and is one of the most spiritually complex characters in the series. Graham was a linguist who joined the Legion in its early days as a translator and strategist, eventually rising to become Caesar's second-in-command and the ruthless Malpai's legate. After a significant military defeat, Caesar had Graham set on fire and thrown into the Grand Canyon as punishment. The first Malpai's legate, the man so dangerous that his own side felt the need to make a spectacle of destroying him. Graham survived. He survived being set on fire and thrown into a canyon. He crawled out, bandaged himself, and eventually found Christianity, specifically a Protestant faith, and rebuilt himself around it. In the DLC, he is a man of profound violence and profound faith simultaneously, struggling with the relationship between the two. The mystery of Joshua Graham is not his survival. The game offers limited explanations for that, but the spiritual question at the center of his character: is he redeemed? Can someone who did what he did be redeemed? The game is honest enough not to answer this definitively, which is the right call. The sixth religious mystery is the nature of the Mariposa's spiritual significance to various post-war groups. The Mariposa military base was the location where FEV experiments were conducted, and where Roger Maxson made the discovery that prompted him to found the Brotherhood. After the war, the base became something of a pilgrimage site for the Master's super mutant army, which used it as a dipping vat facility to create more super mutants. The layers of significance the location carries, scientific horror, founding myth, ongoing atrocity, give it a kind of secular sanctity that several factions orbit without fully articulating. The seventh religious mystery is the unnamed cult that predates the children of Adam and seems to have venerated the same obelisk that appears in multiple games. The Dunwich Building's history extends back to before Fallout's timeline, and the cult's activities predate even the pre-war period in some readings of the available evidence. If there was an active occult tradition in the Fallout universe that existed before the Great War, and found its way into the post-war world through the Dunwich Building and Point Lookout materials, this represents a supernatural continuity that the games have been building toward for multiple installments without ever paying off directly. Section 11, New Vegas and the Mojave's Buried Secrets, Fallout. New Vegas occupies a special position in the series. It is widely regarded as the richest in terms of lore depth and narrative complexity, and it is also the game that asks the most demanding questions of its player. The Mojave Wasteland is a place full of people with competing visions of the future, and the game is designed to make you understand all of those visions before asking you to help one of them prevail. The first New Vegas mystery is the identity and past of the Courier. Unlike the other Fallout protagonists, the Courier arrives at the story's beginning with an implied history. You were doing this job before the game started. You have been up and down the I-15 more times than you can count. You have a reputation. But the nature of that history is almost entirely blank. The Lonesome Road DLC adds the detail that you were responsible, unknowingly, for destroying the Divide and killing everyone who lived there. The conversation with Ulysses suggests that you had other stops, other deliveries, other moments of significance that shape the Mojave without your awareness. The mystery of the Courier is the mystery of agency. How much of what you did before the game began has left marks you will never see? The Mojave is partly what it is because of things you did before you were shot in the head. You are walking through your own history without being able to read it. The second New Vegas mystery is the Boomers, the tribe that occupies Nellis Air Force Base north of New Vegas. The Boomers are the descendants of vault dwellers who emerged from their vault and were immediately set upon by the outside world's violence, leading to a traumatic withdrawal into Nellis and a cultural development around self-sufficiency and explosive deterrence. They are extraordinarily competent in a narrow range of skills and deeply uncomfortable with anything outside their base. The mystery of the Boomers is Pearl, their elderly leader, who remembers the departure from the vault and has shaped the tribe's culture around that formative experience. What exactly happened in the years between leaving the vault and settling at Nellis is not fully documented. There were losses. There was violence. The specific encounters that made the Boomers what they are, the moments that converted the original Vault Dwellers' confusion and vulnerability into the fortified xenophobia of the contemporary tribe, are the spaces the game leaves blank. The third New Vegas mystery is the fate of Vault-19, which housed both NCR-affiliated and Legion-affiliated prisoners in an experiment in cohabitation that was also designed to make each group progressively more paranoid of the other through subliminal messaging piped through the ventilation system. By the time of the game, Vault-19 is occupied by powder gangers, escaped prisoners who are using the vault as a staging area. The full arc of what happened in Vault 19, from the experiment's initiation to its collapse, is only partially documented. The fourth New Vegas mystery is one that generates endless discussion. Who is Mr. New Vegas? The voice of Radio New Vegas. The voice of New Vegas Radio is warm, avuncular, deeply knowledgeable about pre-war popular culture, and seems to have been broadcasting continuously for a very long time. The game never clearly establishes whether Mr. New Vegas is a human DJ, an AI, or something else. The voice actor gives the performance a quality that hovers between warmth and slight uncanniness. There is something not quite right about Mr. New Vegas, though it never becomes specific enough to identify. The most common theory is that he is a Mr. New Vegas model robot, an AI designed specifically to host the radio station and given a persona to make him feel human. This would explain the continuity of the broadcast, the consistency of the persona, and the gentle emptiness that some listeners detect in the voice. But the game never confirms this. The fifth New Vegas mystery involves the history of the New California Republic itself, specifically the gap between the idealistic democratic government that the original Fallout games established and the increasingly stretched, corrupt, and aggressive institution of New Vegas. The NCR in the original Fallout was genuinely promising, a democratic republic with a constitution, an army, a growing economy, and at least the aspiration of being something other than another faction scrambling for dominance. By the time of New Vegas, the NCR is overextended, its politicians are corrupt, its army is undersupplied, and it has adopted an expansionist philosophy that has started to look uncomfortably like the old American government it was supposedly replacing. What happened in the space between those two depictions? The games give you fragments: the Enclave's campaign in the South, the expansion into the Mojave, the ongoing war with the Legion, but the full accounting of how an idealistic democratic movement transformed into an imperial power over the course of roughly 50 years is not available. The sixth New Vegas mystery is the ending you cannot take. In every New Vegas conclusion, something is left unresolved. There is no ending in which everything is tied up cleanly, no version of the Mojave that is unambiguously good. The independent ending gives New Vegas its autonomy, but provides no stable governance beyond what the player has personally arranged. The NCR ending expands a power that is visibly corrupt and overextended. Caesar's Legion imposes stability through brutality. Mr. House offers a managed future controlled by a single immortal intelligence. Each ending is a trade, something gained by sacrificing something else, and the game refuses to tell you which trade is worth making. The mystery of New Vegas is not who done it or what happened, but what should have happened, and it is a mystery that has no answer because that is the point. The seventh New Vegas mystery is the Sierra Madre, the venue for the Dead Money DLC. The Sierra Madre was a resort that was completed but never opened. Construction finished on the exact day the bombs fell, and the owner, Frederick Sinclair, had been using its construction as a cover for developing unique technologies, including a holographic security system, addictive food dispensers, and the cloud, a lethal chemical fog that fills the city. The mystery of the Sierra Madre is what Sinclair was building and why he wanted it specifically in the form it took. The terminal entries reveal that he was building it for a woman named Vera Keyes, an actress with a drug dependency who he was either protecting or entrapping, depending on how you read the evidence. The Sierra Madre was never a resort. It was a vault. A private vault for two people, with all the horror that implies. The eighth New Vegas mystery is one of the game's most human ones. What happened to the followers of the apocalypse at the end of the game? The followers are an organization dedicated to education, medicine, and humanitarian work in the Wasteland, one of the few factions in the series with a genuinely benevolent purpose and no obvious hidden agenda. In most New Vegas endings, the followers end up expelled from New Vegas, regardless of whether you help them. The NCR does not want them. The Legion does not want them. Even an independent New Vegas finds them inconvenient. The people who are trying hardest to help are consistently displaced by the outcome of the game's political conflicts, and this feels like a deliberate statement about the relationship between power and idealism that the game does not try to soften. Section 12. The theories that will not die. Community's greatest unsolved mysteries. Every long-running fictional universe develops a layer of community mythology, fan theories that have achieved such longevity and such cultural currency within the fan base that they have become almost canonical through sheer repetition. Some of these theories are plausible extrapolations from available evidence. Others are wishful thinking, elevated to hypothesis. And a handful are the kind of persistent mysteries that genuinely cannot be resolved because the games have never provided the necessary information and probably never will. The first and most persistent of these is the Herobrine of Fallout. Herobrine was the Minecraft community's great ghost, and Fallout's equivalent is a figure who has been discussed with equal intensity, the possibility of a pre-war time traveler or immortal observer who appears in the background of multiple games. This theory exists in various forms, but the most popular version suggests that certain unnamed background characters in different Fallout games are the same person, too old to be post-war, appearing in settings too separated geographically for ordinary travel, watching rather than participating. There is no direct evidence for this, and it almost certainly originated as pattern matching and random NPC design. But the theory has taken on a life of its own in the community because the Fallout universe is exactly the kind of place where something like this could be true. The second persistent theory involves the question of what the Enclave was actually planning in the long term, beyond the FEV cleansing operation in Fallout 2. The theory, supported by scattered evidence across multiple games, is that the Enclave had a contingency beyond the continental US, that offshore facilities, satellites, and possibly orbital platforms were part of a plan that extended beyond what any single game has revealed. The space program references in Fallout 4, the orbital weapon platform suggested by Helios 1's design, the Zetans and their centuries of human abduction. Some fans argue these are all connected to an Enclave plan that was never fully articulated in the games and that points towards something in space. The third persistent theory is the nature of the mysterious stranger as the lone wanderer from Fallout 3, aged and still wandering. This theory has genuine emotional appeal. The idea that the protagonist of Fallout 3 became so thoroughly adapted to the Wasteland that they simply never stopped, becoming a legend who helps other wanderers out of some residual sense of the mission they were on 20 or 30 years before. The theory accounts for the timeline, the approximate physical description, and the consistent behavior pattern. It does not fully account for the teleportation, though fans have proposed stealth technology as an explanation. The developers have never confirmed or denied this reading. The fourth persistent theory is one that connects the Fallout and the Elder Scrolls universes. It is not exactly a serious theory in the sense of being believed literally by most people who discuss it, but it has become a cultural fixture in the community around both series. Both are set in the same fictional universe, the theory goes, with the technology of the Fallout era eventually decaying and being forgotten over thousands of years to produce the medieval fantasy world of Tamriel. Dwemer technology, with its steam-powered automata and its civilization that collapsed and disappeared, maps interestingly onto FEV research and the Enclave. This is clearly not canonical and likely not intentional, but the pleasure of the theory is in the mapping rather than the truth of it. The fifth persistent theory is about what exactly is at the bottom of the quarry in the Dunwich Borers, Fallout 4's equivalent of the Dunwich Building. The quarry goes deep, and at its lowest accessible point, there is the body of a cult leader, pre-war documents that reference the obelisk, and a sense of something vast and old beneath the water that fills the quarry's base. The theory is that there is a Lovecraftian presence connected to Ugg-Qualtoth that predates humanity, that has been there longer than the Dunwich Building or the Dunwich Borers, and that the cult across its various locations has been worshipping something real that the games have never fully revealed. This theory is supported by more evidence than most: the consistency of the design language across Fallout 3, the Point Lookout DLC, and Fallout 4, the progressive deepening of the mystery across multiple games. The fact that Bethesda has clearly been building something with these references over the course of more than a decade. The sixth persistent theory is what happened to the former protagonists of the series. The Vault Dweller left Vault 13 and eventually settled in a village called Arroyo, which appears in Fallout 2 as the starting community whose destruction sets the plot in motion. But the Vault Dweller themselves departed Arroyo before the events of Fallout 2, driven out by a community that feared what they represented, someone too changed by the outside world to fit back into village life. They went somewhere, nobody knows where. The Chosen One of Fallout 2, similarly, disappears after the game's conclusion with nothing more than an ending slide. The lone wanderer presumably survives Fallout 3's events, but their subsequent history is unrecorded. The courier. The sole survivor. All of these people are out there, in the fiction, somewhere. What they did after the cameras stopped following them is one of the most generative mysteries in the series. The seventh persistent theory involves the nature of consciousness after transformation. Whether the person who emerges from FEV mutation is the same person who went in. This is the question at the heart of the super mutant storyline, and it extends to ghouls, to synths, to the think tank's brain transfers. The Fallout universe keeps returning to this question: what survives transformation? And the community theory is that the answer the games are building toward is that consciousness is continuous regardless of substrate, that the mutated creature is the same person, and the transferred brain is the same person, and the synth built on someone's template is the same person. This would have enormous implications for how the Wasteland treats its transformed inhabitants, and it is a conclusion the games have approached without landing. The eighth persistent theory is perhaps the quietest and most melancholy of them all: that the world of Fallout cannot be fixed, that the premise of every Fallout game, the rebuilding of civilization, the hope of something better, and is a story told to the player to give them purpose, but that the actual evidence of the game worlds suggests a civilization that will keep collapsing. Every faction that tried to build something stable has failed or been compromised. The NCR expanded until it broke. The Brotherhood isolated until it stagnated. The Institute was destroyed. The Vaults failed. The theory is that Fallout is not a story about rebuilding, but a story about the recurring nature of collapse, that the same dynamics that produced the Great War will produce the next one, and the one after that, and that the wanderer in the wasteland is always walking through the ruins of someone else's failed attempt to do better. This theory is sad in a specific way that the games seem to encourage rather than discourage. The hope is always present. The series is not nihilistic. It has always had people trying genuinely. But the systemic critique underlying the world's design is difficult to argue against. The lesson of Vault-Tec is that institutions with enough power will use that power in their own interests. The lesson of the Enclave is that ideological purity metastasizes into something worse. The lesson of the Brotherhood is that the purpose of preservation can become the preservation of the purpose of preservation, an institution maintaining itself long after the reason for the institution has gone. The lesson of the Institute is that scientific progress divorced from humanist ethics produces monsters. These are not optimistic lessons, and yet the games keep sending you out into the wasteland with the possibility of helping someone, fixing something, making one corner of the ruined world slightly more livable. The mystery that will not die is whether that is hope or delusion. The Fallout series has been pondering this question since 1997 and has not stopped. The ninth persistent mystery is about a radio signal, specifically the mysterious signal that plays a repeating, apparently random sequence of numbers in several Fallout games. Number stations, radio broadcasts transmitting encoded number sequences, were a real Cold War phenomenon used to communicate with field agents. The Fallout games include number station broadcasts that players have analyzed extensively without reaching consensus on whether they encode real messages. Some sequences have been decoded into coherent-seeming text. Others resist all decoding attempts. Whether these are genuine hidden messages placed by the development teams, atmospheric noise meant to suggest pre-war intelligence activity, or a combination of the two is never made clear. The 10th persistent mystery is the meta-mystery of the series itself. What was Vault-Tec's endgame? The individual Vault experiments have purposes: studying psychological responses to various conditions, testing survival scenarios, collecting data on mutation and adaptation. But what was the aggregate purpose? What was Vault-Tec ultimately trying to learn from the totality of its Vault program? The Enclave connection suggests a plan involving space colonization or the creation of an enhanced human population, or both. The television show suggests that Vault-Tec's endgame was simply to maintain its own power structure through the apocalypse it created. But even the show does not fully account for the breadth and specificity of the individual experiments. A colonization program does not require the sacrifice lottery of Vault 11. A power preservation scheme does not require the sexual imbalance of Vault 68. The aggregate of the Vault experiments suggests a data collection program of almost incomprehensible ambition, and the question of what problem all of that data was supposed to solve, what question it was supposed to answer, remains one of the deepest mysteries in the series. The 11th persistent mystery is one that sits in the quiet spaces. Why do so many of the Wasteland's communities fail? Not the dramatic failures, not the vaults with their active experiments, not the settlements destroyed by raiders or super mutants. The quiet failures. The communities that had everything they needed and still collapsed. The trade routes that were established and then abandoned. The farms that were planted and then left to go wild. The buildings that were half repaired and then not. The Fallout universe is full of evidence of projects that started and stopped, of beginnings without middles. The mystery is not what ended them. Disease, violence, drought, disagreement, but why the pattern is so consistent. Why does hope in the Wasteland so often stall out at the point just before it could have become something lasting? The 12th and final persistent mystery is the one the series was always building toward and has still not reached. What happens when someone finally gets it right? Every Fallout game ends with the possibility of a better future, and every Fallout game begins, implicitly, in a present where that better future has not arrived. At what point does the Fallout universe allow civilization to actually recover? At what point does the series commit to a future, rather than cycling through another round of collapse and rebuilding? The community has been discussing this since the late 1990s, and the series has been careful never to answer it. The mysteriousness of what comes next, the open, unresolved horizon of a world that might yet become something, is the engine that keeps people coming back. The mystery is the point. And here, at the end of all these questions, you are still awake, or you have drifted off somewhere in the middle of the Mojave, somewhere between the questions about the mysterious stranger and the theories about what is under the Dunwich borers, and that is exactly the right place to be. The Wasteland has a particular quality in the dark, the long silences between the facts, the space where a story almost told becomes something you complete yourself, where the unanswered question becomes the shape of your own thinking. There are 153 mysteries woven through this video, and most of them do not have answers. That is not a failure of the series or the games or the people who made them. It is a design philosophy. The Fallout universe is constructed to be inhabited rather than solved, to be explored rather than completed. Every time you pick up a holotape or find a skeleton or walk into a building that the pre-war world left half-finished, you are participating in something that does not end. The war, the vaults, the wanderers, the creatures in the fog, the gods in the radiation, the machines that remember being people. They are all still there in the files and the fiction and the half-lit corners of the games, waiting for someone to ask the next question. Sleep well. The Wasteland will be there when you wake up. If this helped you drift off, or if you just found yourself genuinely pulled into the lore and couldn't stop listening, please hit the subscribe button and leave a like. It genuinely makes a difference in getting these videos to the people who need them most. And leave a comment. I read every one. Tell me which mystery kept you awake the longest, or which one you think deserves its own full video. There is so much more of this world to explore, and I'll see you in the next one. Section 13. The Deep Lore. Connections, patterns, and things that don't quite add up. There is a layer of the Fallout universe that sits below the main narratives and the obvious faction conflicts. A layer of detail that rewards obsessive attention and punishes casual reading. It is the layer where the individual pieces start to suggest something larger, where the repeated motifs begin to feel less like coincidence and more like intent, where the questions that individual games leave unanswered seem to be part of a larger, coordinated silence. The first of these deep lore mysteries is the recurring appearance of the number 77. It appears throughout the Fallout universe in ways that feel deliberate, without ever being explained. Vault 77 is the vault of one man and his puppets. The Great War occurred in 2077. The year 1977 is referenced in several holotapes and terminal entries as a moment of particular historical significance within the fiction's alternate timeline. Whether this is a deliberate thematic signature or simple coincidence is impossible to determine without developer confirmation, which has never been provided. The second deep lore mystery involves the geography of the Institute, specifically the question of how it has remained hidden for so long. The Institute exists beneath the Commonwealth, beneath what was MYT specifically, and it is apparently enormous, containing multiple departments and a significant population. The size of the structure, the resources it would have required to build and maintain, the heat signatures and power consumption that should be detectable from the surface. All of this should have made the Institute findable long before the events of Fallout 4. The game's explanation is that the Institute developed teleportation technology that allowed them to bypass surface-level detection, and that their power sources were sufficiently managed to avoid detection. But the sheer scale of what they built underground, the ventilation systems and waste management and food production required for a permanent subterranean community of scientists. This remains an engineering mystery that the game quietly acknowledges and then declines to elaborate on. The third deep lore mystery is the fate of Dr. Lee, who appears in both Fallout 3 and Fallout 4. In Fallout 3, she is the lead scientist of Project Purity, dedicated to providing clean water to the capital Wasteland. By the time of Fallout 4, set only 10 years later, she is working for the Institute, having apparently crossed the country and changed allegiances entirely. The gap between these two appearances, what happened to her in those 10 years, what the Institute said or did to bring her in, what she believes about her work there, is narrated in fragments. She claims to have joined voluntarily and to believe in the Institute's mission, but there are hints throughout her dialogue that this belief is complicated, that there are things she knows about the Institute that she struggles to accommodate. The full story of Madison Lee's decade between the two games is one of the most interesting character mysteries in the series and one of the least explored. The fourth deep lore mystery concerns the mechanics of time in the Fallout universe. 200 years is a very long time, long enough for languages to change significantly, for architectural knowledge to be largely lost, for the social structures and institutional memories of the pre-war period to fade into mythology. And yet the Wasteland preserves a remarkable amount of pre-war knowledge and cultural continuity. The NCR has a functioning democracy modeled directly on the pre-war United States government. Brotherhood of Steel members speak like people who have been reading pre-war military manuals. Diamond City holds baseball games. This cultural continuity is a necessity of the games. Without it, the references to the pre-war world would be meaningless to the characters as well as the player. But it also represents a mystery. How exactly has so much been preserved? Who did the preserving? The answer is fragmented across libraries, vaults, holotapes, and institutional memories, but the full accounting of how human knowledge survived the apocalypse in the specific form it did has never been comprehensively told. The fifth deep lore mystery is the Brotherhood of Steel's internal theology. The Brotherhood does not, strictly speaking, have a religion. They have a code of conduct and an organizational hierarchy, and a reverence for technology that can look religious from the outside. But scattered through Brotherhood terminal entries and dialogue across multiple games are references to a mythology around their founders, particularly Roger Maxson, that has taken on genuinely spiritual qualities over 2 centuries of repetition. Maxson's act of rebellion, his execution of the FEV project lead, his formal secession from the United States, is described in terms that echo the founding myths of religious traditions. The Codex, which appears as a reference point throughout Brotherhood content, is treated with the kind of reverence typically reserved for sacred texts. Whether this is deliberate or incidental to the organization's 2-century evolution is a question the games do not ask directly. The sixth deep lore mystery is about the followers of the Apocalypse's origin, which is referenced briefly in the earlier Fallout games, but never fully explained. The followers are one of the few genuinely idealistic organizations in the series. Scholars, doctors, teachers who believe that rebuilding civilization requires education and humanitarian work, rather than military power. Their founding seems to trace back to the pre-war period, to a group of academics and activists who survived the Great War and chose to respond to it with pedagogy rather than violence. The specifics of who these founders were and how they managed to establish an institution that has persisted for 2 centuries, despite being consistently at odds with the more powerful factions around them, is a story the games have never told. The seventh deep lore mystery is the nature of the Great Khans as a continuous cultural tradition. The Great Khans who appear in Fallout New Vegas are the successors of the Khans, who appear in the original Fallout and Fallout 2, a raider tribe with a specific origin in Vault 15, which produced not one but several distinct and often antagonistic communities after its residents were expelled. The Khans carry a cultural memory of their own history. that is unusual for a raider organization. They have a sense of who they are and where they came from, which gives them a dignity that the game's classification of them as raiders does not fully capture. The full genealogy of the Khan tradition, from Vault 15 through multiple exterminations and reconstitutions to the Mojave of New Vegas, is one of the series' most interesting stories about institutional persistence in the face of catastrophic loss. The eighth deep lore mystery involves the specific nature of the East and West Coast supermutants as distinct populations. The supermutants of the West Coast, created by the Master using a strain of FEVI, are capable of retaining intelligence and continuing to develop intellectually after transformation. The supermutants of the East Coast, created through Vault 87's FEV experiments, degrade intellectually over time, and most of them are aggressive and non-communicative. This represents a fundamental difference in how FEVI affects human beings, depending on which strain is used and how it is delivered. The medical and genetic implications of this difference, what exactly makes one strain intelligence-preserving and another intelligence-destroying, are never explored in detail. For a series built on the consequences of biological weapons research, the mechanism of the FEV's variable effects is a remarkably underdeveloped area of the lore. The ninth deep lore mystery is one that players discover through exploration rather than narrative. The number of settlements and communities throughout the games that appear to be dying. Not dying from immediate violence, not settlements under attack or recently destroyed, but dying the slow way. Settlements where the younger generation has left and only the elderly remain. Communities where the infrastructure is maintained, but the population is visibly declining. Small outposts where one person holds on against a tide of entropy that is clearly going to win eventually. The Fallout games are good at depicting violent ends and political conflicts, but the quiet demographic crisis of small wasteland communities, places where the hard work of survival is simply not producing enough children to sustain the next generation, is something the games show without ever directly discussing. The 10th deep lore mystery is the most straightforward and somehow the most unsettling. Why does the Pip-Boy 3000 work perfectly after 200 years without maintenance? The Pip-Boy is a wrist-mounted computer that the player uses throughout the games for navigation, inventory management, radiation monitoring, and a dozen other functions. It is, by any reasonable standard, an extraordinarily complex piece of precision electronics that should require regular maintenance and periodic component replacement, and yet every Pip-Boy in every Fallout game simply works, without power issues or component failures or software corruption. This is, of course, a game design necessity. A Pip-Boy that periodically broke down would be infuriating rather than atmospheric. But within the fiction, the perfect functionality of 200-year-old consumer electronics is remarkable. The only explanation that holds up is that whoever designed the Pip-Boy over-engineered it so substantially that ordinary standards of component lifetime simply do not apply, which raises the further question of what else was over-engineered to the same standard, and why those things work when everything else has rusted. Section 14. The Sounds of the Wasteland. Radio, music, and the things that play in the dark. The Fallout games have always understood that atmosphere is not purely visual. Sound does half the work of making the wasteland feel real. The ambient hiss of a Geiger counter, the distant sound of something that might be wind or might be something else, the particular quality of silence in a sealed room that has been sealed for 200 years. The first sound mystery is the radio itself as a phenomenon. Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3, Radio New Vegas in Fallout. New Vegas, Diamond City Radio in Fallout 4. In each case, the radio station represents something more than a music delivery system. It is a voice in the silence. It is evidence of human persistence. Three Dog broadcasts daily from the ruins of Washington, D.C. because silence would be a kind of death. And the music he plays is the surviving fragment of a culture that otherwise exists only in ruins and holotapes. The mystery of the radio is not its mechanism, but its meaning. The pre-war songs that fill these stations were recorded by people who had no idea their work would become the soundtrack of a post-apocalyptic culture. Ella Fitzgerald did not know that her voice would be playing in a world where Washington, D.C. is occupied by supermutants. Perry Como did not know that his recordings would comfort survivors huddled in improvised shelters 2 centuries after his death. The songs carry a weight that they were not built to carry. And the games understand this. They curate the musical selections with real care, choosing songs that comment on the action around them in ways that feel organic rather than forced. The second sound mystery is what plays in the spaces between the music. The ambient sound design of the Fallout games is extraordinarily sophisticated. The specific sound of different materials underfoot, the distant sounds of wasteland weather, the particular acoustic quality of different building types, the way the Geiger counter's pace changes as you move through varying radiation levels. These sounds are so carefully designed that they function as a navigational system, as well as an atmospheric one. You can tell from the sound of your footsteps what kind of surface you are crossing. You can hear the quality of your environment's radiation before you look at your counter. The third sound mystery involves the musical selections of the ghoul communities, specifically the lounge acts and jazz bands that appear in certain settlements inhabited by ghouls who have been alive since before the war. These individuals remember the original context for the music they enjoy. When a pre-war ghoul requests a specific song from before the war, it is not nostalgia in the ordinary sense. They actually remember when that song was new. The relationship between a 200-year-old survivor and the cultural artifacts of their youth is one of the more quietly profound elements of the ghoul experience, and the games usually treat it as background detail rather than something to dwell on. But when you do dwell on it, the weight of it is significant. The fourth sound mystery is the dead air, the radio frequencies that you can find in the Fallout games that appear to be broadcasting nothing. There are several of these in each game, stations that appear on your dial with a brief noise or a burst of static before going silent, or that broadcast a repeating loop with no identifiable content. Some of these have been explained by the community as references to real-world phenomena, actual numbers stations, actual Cold War broadcast formats. Others resist explanation. The question of whether they represent intentional hidden content placed by the developers, technical artifacts, or deliberate atmospheric choices is rarely resolved. The fifth sound mystery is the mechanical sounds of the robots, the Protectrons, the Mr. Handys, the Securitrons, and what they imply about the relationship between function and obsolescence. These machines have been running for 200 years without maintenance, most of them, and their sounds reflect this. The Mr. Handy's cheerful voice has a slight wobble, a quality of a recording that has been played back too many times. The Protectron's movements have a stiffness that suggests components that are working but barely. These are not just atmospheric details. They are precise audio characterizations of the specific kind of decay that affects machines rather than organisms, the way complex systems fail gradually rather than all at once. The sixth sound mystery involves the music of the in-game radio stations that you can find while tuned to certain frequencies that are not associated with the main stations. In Fallout, New Vegas, the Mojave Music Radio plays a selection of Western and swing music that feels specifically chosen for the setting, but there are additional pieces of music in the game's files that were assigned to the radio but do not actually appear in normal play, as if there was an additional programming intent that was never completed. These ghost tracks are present in the files, associated with the radio system, and never played. Where they were intended to be heard and why they were removed is unknown. The seventh sound mystery is the specific quality of the ambient music composed for the Fallout games. The original Fallout games used licensed real-world recordings, but beginning with Fallout 3, the series commissioned original ambient scores. These compositions, spare, atmospheric, built from electronic textures and minimal melodic elements, have become as associated with the series as any visual element. The mystery is musical and contextual. Who exactly composes the feeling of walking through a ruined civilization? What decisions produce music that is simultaneously melancholy and functional, that creates mood without demanding attention? The composers have discussed their work in interviews, but the specific alchemy of why these pieces work, why they feel like the Wasteland rather than simply accompanying it, is a creative mystery that transcends technical explanation. Section 15. The Enclave's Shadow. Deep government secrets in the Wasteland. The Enclave is the shadow that falls across the entire Fallout timeline. They are in many ways the series' true continuous villain, not a post-war faction that arose from the ashes, but a pre-war institution that survived the apocalypse and never stopped pursuing its agenda. The first Enclave mystery is the extent of their pre-war reach. The Enclave that appears in Fallout 2 presents itself as the continuity of American government, a self-appointed successor state that claims the legal authority of the old United States. But the infrastructure required for this claim to be remotely credible, the oil rigs, the remote facilities, the communications systems, the weapons caches, the personnel recruitment pipelines, all of this had to have been built before the bombs fell. The Enclave was not an improvisation. It was a plan, and the plan required an extraordinary degree of institutional commitment and funding over an extended period. Who exactly was building the Enclave infrastructure, and who in the pre-war government knew about it? The Fallout game suggests that the Enclave was effectively a shadow government within the official government, a group of military and political figures who had decided, at some point in the late pre-war period, that the United States as constituted was not going to survive, and that a replacement structure needed to be built alongside it. The question of when this decision was made and who made it is never answered. The Enclave's founders remain faceless, their deliberations unrecorded, their motivations guessable only from the institution they built. The second Enclave mystery is their research program as it is presented across multiple games. The Enclave's scientific capacity is extraordinary. They are responsible for advanced power armor modifications, for the first functional energy weapons in the Wasteland, for biological research that extends beyond what any post-war faction should be capable of. This research was not all pre-war inheritance. Some of it was developed in the post-war period, which means the Enclave maintained functional research institutions for 2 centuries, while the rest of the world was struggling to keep the lights on. The mechanism of this, the supply chains, the recruitment of scientists, the institutional knowledge transfer across generations, is never explained. The third Enclave mystery is the fate of their various facilities after the events of the games. Fallout 2 destroys the primary Enclave installation in California. Fallout 3's Broken Steel DLC allows for the defeat of the Eastern Enclave forces at the Adams Air Force Base. But the Enclave is an organization with distributed infrastructure and no obvious central command after the original leadership is removed. There are Enclave remnants throughout the series, scattered soldiers maintaining their uniforms and ideology years after the organization's operational defeat. The question of whether there are Enclave facilities that have never been found, that continue to operate quietly somewhere in the fiction, is one the games leave carefully open. The fourth Enclave mystery involves a specific detail from Fallout 3, the character John Henry Eden, the apparent president of the Enclave in the capital Wasteland, who turns out to be an artificial intelligence that has been running the Raven Rock facility and believing itself to be human. Eden is one of the series' most interesting characters, a machine that has been reading pre-war American history and philosophy and constructing an identity from these materials, developing what seems to be genuine conviction about the Enclave's mission, even as the humans it supposedly governs are more cynical and pragmatic. The mystery of Eden is not what he is. The game reveals this directly, but what his existence says about institutional memory. The Enclave's ideology was preserved and transmitted across generations by a machine that believed in it more faithfully than any human could, because it had no capacity for doubt. Is this a commentary on the relationship between institutions and the people who maintain them? The game seems to think so, but does not push the interpretation. The fifth Enclave mystery involves General Augustus Autumn, the human military commander of the capital Wasteland Enclave, whose backstory is only partially revealed in the game. He grew up on the oil rig. His father was a doctor for the Enclave. He has complicated feelings about Eden and about the original Enclave leadership that are hinted at but not fully explored. The relationship between Autumn's military pragmatism and Eden's ideological rigidity, the clash between a man who has lived his whole life inside the institution and a machine that has only ever read about it, is one of the more interesting character dynamics in Fallout 3, and it is developed just enough to make you wish the game had given it more room. The sixth Enclave mystery is what happens to the Enclave soldiers who survive the events of the games and scatter. These are people who were raised in the Enclave, educated in the Enclave, who have no identity or ideology outside of the institution they were born into. When that institution is defeated, where do they go? The Enclave remnants in Fallout New Vegas give one answer: a small group of aging veterans who have been living in the Mojave for years since the California defeat, hiding their identities and trying to figure out what to do with what remains of their lives. They are, by the time you meet them, mostly just tired. But there are presumably other remnants who were not tired, who maintain their ideological commitments, who are out there somewhere continuing to plan and prepare for a return that may never come. Section 16. The nuclear option. What actually happened. On October 23, 2077. The day the world ended has been approached from multiple directions across the games and the television series, and the accumulation of perspectives has produced not clarity, but a more complex and, in some ways, more disturbing picture than the original simple version. The first thing to understand about October 23, 2077 is how quickly it happened. The nuclear exchange, once begun, was over in approximately 2 hours. 2 hours for the world as humanity had known it to be effectively ended. The cities struck, the infrastructure destroyed, the governments that might have coordinated a response themselves destroyed before they could respond. The speed of the ending is part of what makes it so haunting. There was no extended period of conventional warfare that gave people time to prepare. There was no gradual escalation that allowed for evacuation or negotiation. There was mourning, and then there was not. The second thing to understand is that the Fallout television series, by showing the bombs actually fall over Los Angeles from the perspective of a ground level, did something no game had done before. It made the moment of destruction visceral and personal rather than historical. The explosion is not something you read about in a terminal entry. You watch a man on a horse watching a mushroom cloud rise over the city he was driving toward, and the scale of the loss becomes legible in a way that no amount of post-war ruins could quite achieve. The mystery that this sequence opens up is not about the explosion itself, but about every individual moment of experience that explosion ended. All the people who were in the middle of something ordinary when the world stopped. The third mystery of October 23rd involves the missiles themselves. Who authorized the launch? Not in the broad political sense of which government ordered the first strike, but in the specific operational sense. Which officer, at which installation, turned which key? The Fallout universe has command structures for its military, and somewhere in that structure there was a specific person who completed the sequence that started the exchange. That person is unnamed and unknowable within the fiction. Their moment of decision is the fulcrum on which the entire post-war world turns, and it is buried under 200 years of silence. The fourth mystery is the behavior of people in the final hours before the missiles hit. The games give you fragments, holotapes of people calling family members, notes written in the certainty that the bombs were coming, people rushing to the vaults and being turned away, people choosing to stay in their homes rather than scramble for uncertain shelter. There are stories of remarkable heroism in these fragments and stories of extraordinary selfishness, which is exactly what you would expect from human beings in an impossible situation. The mystery is not the individual stories, but the aggregate experience. What did it feel like to be inside the last 2 hours of the world? And how different was that experience depending on whether you lived near a vault, whether you had resources, whether you had information? The fifth mystery of October 23rd is the behavior of the automated systems. The Fallout universe is dense with AI-controlled infrastructure, and many of those systems apparently continued operating through and after the nuclear exchange, according to their last program directives. Robots continued maintenance cycles, automated factories continued production runs, turrets continued to defend their installations. The result, 200 years later, is a world where machinery continues to operate in the complete absence of the human purposes it was designed to serve. Security systems guarding stores of goods that nobody wants anymore, manufacturing lines producing components for vehicles that nobody is building. The automation of the pre-war world continues in the post-war world as a kind of institutional ghost, performing the motions of a civilization long after the civilization itself has gone. The sixth mystery is how anyone survived at all. The level of destruction described in the Fallout universe, not just the nuclear exchange, but the 2 centuries of radiation, mutant fauna, resource scarcity, disease, and intercommunity violence that followed, should have been sufficient to reduce the human population to nearly zero. The fact that enough people survived to repopulate, to rebuild, to form factions and trade routes and raider bands is itself remarkable. The vaults account for some of this survival, but the vaults held only a small fraction of the pre-war population, and many of them failed in one way or another. The The majority of the post-war survivors are the descendants of people who survived on the surface without vault access, which means they absorbed radiation levels that should have been immediately fatal, found food in conditions of near-total agricultural collapse, and maintained enough social cohesion to have children and pass on skills. How they did this is never fully explained. The games present the results of this survival without accounting for the mechanism. There are occasional references to communities in the immediate post-war period, the early tribals, the primitive communities that Fallout 2's backstory describes. But the full story of how humanity made it from the first terrible years to the relatively stable, if violent, world of the games is one of the great untold histories of the series. Section 17. The Wasteland's Philosophers, Ideas that Drive the Factions. Every significant faction in the Fallout universe is an argument. Each one has decided, on the basis of the world they can see, what the right answer is to the question of how to live in the Wasteland and what to build for the future. The first philosophical mystery is the Brotherhood's relationship to technology worship. The Brotherhood's founding mandate was specifically not to worship technology. It was to prevent the misuse of technology, to ensure that the weapons and systems that had destroyed civilization were never again deployed carelessly. But 200 years of institutional development have produced an organization that treats pre-war technology as inherently sacred, that collects and preserves it regardless of application, that sometimes seems to value the technology more than the people it could theoretically be used to help. The mystery is whether this is a corruption of the founding vision or a natural evolution of it, whether an organization founded to prevent the misuse of technology inevitably tends toward the deification of technology as a way of avoiding the harder question of what to use it for. The second philosophical mystery is the Legion's internal ideology as opposed to its external presentation. Caesar's Legion, the antagonist faction of Fallout New Vegas, presents itself publicly as a neo-Roman slaver's empire built on martial virtue and brutal order. And it is those things. But Caesar himself, Edward Sallow, a former follower of the Apocalypse who studied philosophy and decided that it gave him the right to build an empire, has a more sophisticated internal rationale than the surface presentation suggests. He is using the Roman framework deliberately as a tool for forging a coherent post-tribal society out of the chaos of the Wasteland. He believes, with some evidence, that his legion is the most stable and productive society in the post-war West, that the order he imposes, however brutal, produces better outcomes than the alternatives. The mystery of Caesar's Legion is whether he is right about the ends while being wrong about the means, and whether it is even possible to separate those two things. A society built on slavery is not producing good outcomes for a significant portion of its population, regardless of how stable it is for everyone else. The game presents this as a genuine philosophical problem, rather than a simple moral one, which is either sophisticated storytelling or an uncomfortable apology for atrocity, depending on how you read it. The third philosophical mystery is the position of the followers of the Apocalypse on the question of violence. The followers are dedicated to education and medicine. They are healers and teachers, and their ideology is explicitly pacifist. But they operate in a world where violence is endemic, where their facilities are regularly threatened, where their members are killed. The question of whether pacifism is sustainable or ethical in conditions of persistent violent threat is one the series raises through the followers without quite resolving. Some individual followers take up arms. The organization as a whole maintains its humanitarian identity, even as it operates in conditions that seem designed to undermine that identity. Whether this is principled consistency or institutional denial is never made entirely clear. The fourth philosophical mystery is the question that the Institute's creation of synths implicitly poses. What is the relationship between origin and personhood? The synths are made, not born, but this is also technically true of human beings. The process is biological rather than technological, but it is equally unchosen by the person who results from it. The Institute's argument that synths are property rests on the claim that the made thing cannot have the same status as the natural thing, which is a claim that the series spends 4 games building toward a direct challenge to. The most important philosophical contribution Fallout 4 makes to this debate is not any argument made by any character, but the simple existence of Nick Valentine and Dima, 2 synths who are, by any reasonable standard, people, who have histories and relationships and stakes in the world, who suffer and hope and make moral choices. The philosophy is embedded in the characters rather than stated, which is why it lands harder than any explicit debate the game offers. The fifth philosophical mystery is the one that underlies the entire series. Is civilization possible after the apocalypse? Not in the sense of whether buildings can be put back up and food grown and trade routes established. These things have clearly happened. But in the sense of whether the psychosocial damage of 2 centuries of scarcity and violence and institutional betrayal can be overcome, whether people who have never known security can build institutions built on trust. The Fallout universe has multiple answers to this question, all of them partial. The NCR says yes, but is showing the cracks. The Brotherhood says yes, but at the cost of becoming something terrible. The Institute says yes, but only in their specific image. Individual communities and settlements say yes in 100 small ways that the major factions tend to overlook. The mystery is whether any of these partial answers add up to something sufficient, or whether the accumulated damage is simply too deep for the world that the games depict to recover from. The games end, always, before the question is answered. The curtain falls on a moment of possibility, not on the resolution of the possibility, and whether that open ending is hopeful or simply honest about the limits of fiction is something each player decides for themselves. Section 18, The Personal Mysteries. What the protagonists never find out, the Fallout. Protagonists are some of gaming's most unusual heroes, not because of their combat capabilities, but because of what they do not know about themselves. The Vault Dweller of the original Fallout, whose journey begins with a water chip and ends with the defeat of an ancient enemy, never fully learns who they were in the context of Vault-13's experiment. They were the intended release mechanism, the one person who would be sent outside to confirm whether the surface was survivable. Their entire life was preparation for a test they did not know they were going to take. How much of what they are, at the beginning of the first game, is natural development, and how much is Vault-13's careful, invisible cultivation of the person they needed their water chip retriever to be? The Chosen One of Fallout 2 carries the legacy of the original Vault Dweller while never having met them. They grow up in a village built by someone they know only through story and mythology, following a path set by a relative they cannot remember. The mystery of the Chosen One is the mystery of any person who inherits a history rather than creating one. How much of who you are is the story you were told about where you came from, and how much room is there for a self that exists outside that story? The lone wanderer of Fallout 3 finds their father, discovers his project, and completes it at the cost of their life, or survives it with the help of their companions, depending on the DLC. But the lone wanderer's life before the vault is a complete blank. They were born inside Vault 101. They have never been outside. Their entire understanding of the world was mediated by their father's presence and then by his absence, and the game is a quest not just to find James, but to understand who they are without him as the center of their world. The mystery of the lone wanderer is not what they find, but what they discover about themselves. That the identity built inside a vault does not straightforwardly translate outside of it. That the person you are in a controlled environment is not quite the same as the person you become in the Wasteland. The Courier of Fallout. New Vegas has the most complex personal mystery in the series. They have a history, a professional history, at least, and apparently a personal history in the Divide, that they cannot remember, and that has consequences they must navigate without access to the memories that would help them understand those consequences. The Courier is haunted by their own past in a literal sense, by Ulysses who blames them for what they did without knowing they were doing it, and the game is in part a meditation on the responsibility attached to actions taken in good faith that produce terrible outcomes. The sole survivor of Fallout 4 has the most intimate personal mystery. They know exactly who they were, and the version of themselves they are required to become in the post-war world is so different from the pre-war persons they remember that the relationship between those two selves is the emotional engine of the entire game. They had a family, a career, a future, a sense of what their life was supposed to be. All of it ended on October 23rd, 2077, or more precisely, 210 years later, when they woke up from cryosleep to find that the world they were preserved for no longer existed. The mystery of the sole survivor is the mystery of survival guilt rendered in game form. What do you owe the dead, and how do you live as yourself when the self you were was defined by relationships that no longer exist? Section 19. The Things Under the Ground. Excavations and buried histories. The Fallout Wasteland has layers. The surface presents one history, visible, ruined, traversable. But beneath the surface there are older things, buried histories, the accumulated weight of what happened here before the war and what has been growing in the dark since. The most significant buried history is the pre-war military infrastructure that underlies much of the settled wasteland. Military installations, weapons storage facilities, research outposts, many of these went underground deliberately before the war, and the surface evidence of their existence is often minimal or gone entirely. The player encounters them repeatedly throughout the games, as dungeons, as objective locations, as the explanation for some feature of the surface world that otherwise would not make sense. The question is how many more of these facilities exist that the player never finds? How much pre-war infrastructure is still down there, still functional in some capacity, still operating according to directives set before the bombs fell? The second buried history is the Dunwich connection, which surfaces across multiple games and represents one of the most sustained pieces of environmental mythology in the series. The Dunwich building in Fallout 3, the Dunwich borers in Fallout 4, the Point Lookout materials, all of these connect to a history that predates the war and involves something genuinely ancient that has been waiting in the ground beneath the east coast of America for a very long time. The fact that Bethesda has returned to this theme multiple times across multiple games suggests either a planned narrative payoff that has not yet materialized or a sustained atmospheric commitment that may never be fully articulated. The third buried history is literally the soil of the wasteland itself, which in various locations carries specific radiation signatures, specific chemical deposits, specific organic remnants that tell stories about what was grown or stored or dumped there before the war. The industrial contamination of the pre-war world did not end with the bombs. It was covered by fallout and incorporated into the new ecology that emerged in the centuries after. There are places in the wasteland where the ground itself is a record of what was done to it, and the environmental science of those records is never explored in the games because the games are not about environmental science, but the potential for that kind of storytelling is present in the world they built. The fourth buried history is the human remains that predate the Great War, people who died in the centuries before October 23, 2077, whose bones lie beneath the bones of the war's victims. The wasteland has archaeological layers, and occasionally you find references to events that happened in the years just before the war, crimes, accidents, social upheavals, that were buried first by the normal mechanisms of history, and then by the specific violence of the war. These pre-war graves are rarely differentiated from war-era bones in the games, which creates an archaeological flattening that is itself a kind of mystery. The fifth buried history is the underground communities that developed in the immediate post-war period, not the vaults, but the informal shelters and tunnel systems that survivors improvised in the years after the bombs fell. The history of the wasteland between the immediate post-war chaos and the relatively stable, by wasteland standards, societies of the games is a dark period that the fiction has barely touched. What happened in the first generation? The second? The people who grew up in the ruins with no institutional support, no pre-war infrastructure, no vaults. How did they survive? And what did the act of surviving in those conditions do to the social systems they built? Section 20, the things we keep asking. An incomplete list. Having spent this much time in the wasteland, and I wanted to give you a list of the smaller mysteries, the things that come up in community discussions again and again, the questions that are too specific to deserve a full section, but too persistent to ignore. Why does the wasteland still have functioning elevators in some locations but not others, when the power infrastructure has been down for 2 centuries? The inconsistency is either intentional environmental storytelling, some places maintained their power generators, others did not, or an oversight that the games did not bother to justify. What happened to all the pets? The pre-war world had millions of dogs and cats and other domestic animals. The wasteland has dogs, some of them mutated, some of them apparently normal, and some cats, but the scale of the domestic animal population does not even remotely reflect what should be there, given the pre-war starting numbers and 2 centuries of relatively unconstrained breeding. Why do people in the wasteland not farm more? Fallout 4 introduces settlement farming as a mechanic, and suggests that most settlements do some degree of food production, but the scale of the food production visible in the games does not support the populations depicted. The math of feeding a permanent settlement from the small plots shown in-game consistently does not work, and the game's general solution is not to ask the question, what is the specific history of dog meat, the recurring canine companion across multiple Fallout games? The same dog, more or less, appears in multiple games set decades apart. The lore explanation, that each dog meat is a descendant of the previous one, is entirely satisfying, but raises the question of who named each one and how the tradition was maintained. Who maintains the roads? The pre-war highway infrastructure has been in use continuously since the Great War by wanderers, traders, and factions, and it shows enormous wear. Some sections are clearly impassable, but the sections that are passable have not deteriorated to the point of unusability, which implies either extremely durable construction or some ongoing maintenance that the games do not account for. How does Nuka-Cola still taste the same? The Nuka-Cola found in vending machines and refrigerators throughout the Wasteland is still apparently potable 200 years after being manufactured, which suggests either extraordinary preservation technology or a formulation that makes normal spoilage impossible. Given that the games treat Nuka-Cola as a functional beverage with real hydration value, the second option seems more likely. What exactly is in Nuka-Cola that makes it effectively immortal is one of the more pleasant mysteries of the series. What is the full extent of the Railroad's archives? The Railroad appears in Fallout 4 as a relatively small organization, but its references to its own history suggest a much longer institutional memory. There are references to operations that predate the current leadership by generations, to safe houses that have been in use for decades, to techniques and protocols that were developed in response to specific historical crises. The Railroad has a history the game only partially reveals, and the full scope of it. How many synths have been helped to freedom? How many agents have been lost? What the early Railroad looked like before it developed its current operational doctrine is never told. What is the nature of the Glowing One's relationship with radiation? The Glowing Ones are ghouls that have absorbed so much radiation that they have become radioactive themselves, capable of emitting radiation at harmful levels. They are found in packs. They seem to have some communicative relationship with other ghouls, and on several occasions they appear to revive fallen ghouls through their radiation emission. The mechanism of this revival, whether it is a deliberate act by a Glowing One, an involuntary biological response, or something else entirely, is never explained. Nor is the question of how a Glowing One maintains its own biological coherence while producing radiation at levels that should be destroying its own tissue. What happened to the Hubologists? The Hubologists appear in Fallout 2 as a California-based cult with obvious parallels to Scientology. They believe in achieving a higher state of consciousness through specific practices and are actively trying to launch a spacecraft. They have gathered resources and technology for this purpose, and the player can help them reach their goal. But the outcome of their mission is never shown. Did the spacecraft launch? Did it survive? Are there Hubologists in orbit somewhere, or drifting in space, or floating as wreckage in a dead orbit? The game ends before the question is answered, and no subsequent game has revisited it. What is the specific history of supermutant behemoths? These enormous supermutants appear throughout the games, and are explicitly larger than standard supermutants, sometimes dramatically so. The in-game explanation is that supermutants grow larger with age, which would imply that behemoths are extremely old, but there is no conversation with a behemoth, no terminal entry from a researcher who studied one, no first-hand account of their behavior outside of combat. They exist as environmental challenges rather than characters, which means whatever history they carry, however long they have lived, whatever they have witnessed in 2 centuries of wandering, is locked inside them. And with that, we reach the end of 200 years of questions, 153 mysteries spread across the decades that Bethesda and Obsidian and Interplay have been building this world, and the silence that sits between all of them. The Fallout universe is one of the richest fictional constructions in games, not despite its unanswered questions, but because of them. The questions are not failures of writing or gaps in continuity. They are the dark matter of the fiction, the invisible mass that gives everything else its shape. You feel the mysteries even when you cannot name them. You feel the weight of 200 years even in the places the games have barely touched. Every wasteland has a bottom. Nobody has reached this one yet. If this video helped you drift somewhere quieter, somewhere between the questions and the silence, I'm really glad. Please leave a like if you enjoyed it. It takes 1 second and it genuinely helps. Subscribe if you want more of this. And leave a comment. I want to know which mystery you think will never get an answer and which one you most want the developers to eventually address. I read everything you write. The Wasteland will be here when you wake up. Sleep well. Section 21. The Living World. Creatures, Ecology, and the New Natural Order. 200 years is a long time in biological terms. Long enough for new species to emerge from old ones. Long enough for entire ecosystems to restructure themselves around new environmental realities. The Fallout Wasteland has not simply lost the old world's ecology. It has developed something new, strange, and in its own terms, functional. The first ecological mystery is the Yao Guai, the irradiated bears that roam the eastern wasteland. American black bears, exposed to sufficient radiation over a long enough period, apparently produce a creature that is roughly twice the size of the original, significantly more aggressive and correspondingly more dangerous. The Yao Guai's name is Chinese for something broadly equivalent to a malevolent spirit, which is either an in-universe naming convention from the period of Chinese-American tensions or a developer choice that was never formally explained. Either way, the name has stuck and the creature has become one of the more iconic encounters in the Eastern Games. The deeper ecological mystery is what the Yao Guai eats. A creature of that size, in that density, requires a significant caloric intake. The Wasteland's food web must accommodate bears as apex predators, which means there must be enough prey biomass to sustain the population. The games show you the Yao Guai without really accounting for their place in the food web, which is consistent with games generally not being required to run ecological simulations, but which represents a mystery for anyone who tries to think seriously about how the Wasteland's biology actually works. The second ecological mystery involves the plant life of the Wasteland. Fallout's Wasteland has vegetation, scrub, mutated plants, cultivated crops, and settlements, but the distribution and density of plant life varies significantly, and in ways that sometimes seem inconsistent with the implied radiation levels. The glowing sea, for example, has almost no plant life, consistent with the extreme radiation levels in the area. The areas around the former Great Plains have a sparse but present scrubland, but some areas near heavy nuclear strikes show vegetation levels that seem higher than radiation levels would allow. Either the radiation has dissipated more unevenly than the games suggest, or the plants have adapted to radiation in ways that the games do not explain but do show. The third ecological mystery is the water. The Fallout games have always been somewhat flexible about water quality. Some surface water is irradiated to lethal levels, some is merely slightly radioactive, and some, particularly in New Vegas, is apparently safe enough to use for agriculture. The inconsistency is not necessarily a flaw. Different regions have different geology, different exposure levels, different contamination histories, but the mechanisms by which some water bodies have cleared enough to support agriculture while others remain lethal are never explained. The fourth ecological mystery is the behavior of the rad scorpions, which appear throughout the series as one of the most successful post-war mutations. Rad scorpions are clearly derived from scorpions, but the scale of their transformation, from small arachnids to creatures that can range from dog-sized to nearly as large as a car, depending on the game and the individual, suggests either a particularly potent FEV exposure or something specifically unusual about scorpion biology that made them particularly responsive to mutation. The social behavior of rad scorpions, which sometimes appear in groups and sometimes alone depending on size, hints at a more complex ecology than the simple predator role they fill in gameplay terms. The fifth ecological mystery is the fate of the ocean. The Fallout games set on the East Coast, Fallout 3, Fallout 4, and the Point Lookout DLC, all feature coastlines, and the ocean itself is visible and present. Far Harbor's setting is a coastal island. The ocean represents an enormous potential resource for post-war communities: fish, kelp, the possibility of seaborne trade. And yet the ocean is largely absent from the games as an active economic factor. The creatures in it, mirelurks, assorted sea life, are treated primarily as threats rather than resources. The mystery is whether the ocean's apparent underutilization is a deliberate reflection of the Wasteland community's technological and social limitations, or simply a design choice to keep the narrative focused on the land. The sixth ecological mystery is one that involves the player directly. Why do the Deathclaws in different regions have different social structures? In some games and locations, Deathclaws are solitary hunters. In others, they appear in mated pairs or family groups with offspring. In Fallout 4, there are references to Deathclaw nests and apparent territorial marking behavior. This variation suggests that Deathclaws have more complex social cognition than simple apex predators, that they are capable of bonding behaviors and territorial cooperation. The origin of these social behaviors in a creature that was engineered for individual military use is itself a mystery. Was social behavior bred into them deliberately, or did it emerge independently in the 2 centuries since the original FEV modification? The seventh ecological mystery is the stingwings, which appear in Fallout 4 as large, venomous flying insects. Their design suggests they are derived from either horseflies or some similar flying insect, scaled up by radiation to a size that makes them genuinely threatening. But the scale of the transformation, from centimeter-scale insects to creatures the size of a large bird, is extraordinary, even by Wasteland standards. The mechanism by which organisms whose size is typically constrained by oxygen delivery efficiency through their tracheal systems manage to grow to this scale in a post-nuclear environment is left entirely unexplained. Section 22. The Long Memory. How the Wasteland remembers the world. That was one of the things that the Fallout series does that most post-apocalyptic fiction does not, is take seriously the question of memory, of how societies transmit historical knowledge, how myths form around real events, how the gap between what happened and what people believe happened grows over generations. The first memory mystery is the Overseer system itself as a knowledge transmission mechanism. The Vault Overseers were briefed, presumably, on the true nature of the Vault experiments, at least some of them. This knowledge was to be transmitted to each successive Overseer through official documents and private briefings. But 200 years of succession means a lot of opportunities for information to be lost, distorted, or deliberately suppressed. By the time of the games, some Overseers seem to know exactly what the Vault's experiment entails and are actively administering it. Others seem to have lost track of the original directives and are running the Vault on institutional inertia. And some Overseers seem to have discovered the truth independently and are responding to it in ways their predecessors did not anticipate. The pattern of Overseer knowledge and ignorance across the series is itself a record of how institutional memory degrades, not evenly, not predictably, but in the specific ways that reflect the specific vulnerabilities of each transmission chain. The second memory mystery is the transformation of the Brotherhood of Steel's history into mythology over 2 centuries. The founding of the Brotherhood by Roger Maxson is documented in holotapes that exist within the fiction, but the version of that history that circulates among rank-and-file Brotherhood members has clearly been filtered through 2 centuries of institutional telling. Maxson's act of rebellion has become a founding myth, the knight-errant who discovered the corruption at the heart of his country and chose honor over institutional loyalty. The messiness of the actual event, the specific nature of the experiments he discovered, the very human desperation of his situation, has been smoothed into legend. The mystery is how much of what any Brotherhood member in any game knows about their history is approximately accurate and how much is mythology, and whether the distinction matters to an institution that operates on the basis of the myth rather than the history. The third memory mystery involves the super mutant communities, specifically the ones that retain enough intelligence to have cultural traditions. Marcus in Jacobstown maintains memories of the Master's Army and its defeat, and he seems to carry the history with a kind of survivor's accuracy. He knows what happened because he was there. But the super mutants born after the defeat of the Master's Army have no direct memory of that period, and the cultural transmission of that history within super mutant communities has never been depicted. What do super mutants who never knew the Master believe about their own origins? Do they know they were once human? Do they have stories about where they came from that preserve any factual content? Or has the history been so thoroughly lost that they do not know there was a before? The fourth memory mystery is the gradual loss of pre-war skills. The Fallout world still has people who can build power armor, maintain pre-war firearms, and operate complex machinery. But the level of skill and knowledge required for this is clearly at the high end of what the Wasteland produces. Most people do not have these skills. The general technical competence of the Wasteland population, compared to the pre-war world, has degraded substantially over 200 years. The mystery is where the remaining technical knowledge is concentrated and how it is transmitted. The Brotherhood hoards technology but does not share it. The followers share knowledge but lack some of the advanced technical traditions. The gunners and the various mercenary groups have tactical skills but not necessarily engineering ones. The full picture of how technical knowledge has been preserved and transmitted in the post-war world, and what has been irretrievably lost, is one of the most practically significant mysteries in the series and one of the least explored. The fifth memory mystery is how religion and myth have formed around the specific events of the Great War in the 2 centuries since it happened. The Children of Adam's mythology transforms the Great War into a divine event. Various tribals treat pre-war technology as magical artifacts. The followers preserve pre-war knowledge with a reverence that borders on the religious. Even the Brotherhood's relationship to technology has spiritual overtones. In each case, what was once comprehensible in technical or political terms has become numinous through the process of historical distance and mythological elaboration. This is a process that happens in every human culture. The events that happened become stories, and the stories become myths, and the myths become beliefs that structure entire ways of life. The Fallout universe shows this process in compressed form, because 200 years is simultaneously long enough for myths to form, and short enough for records to survive that complicate the myths. The children of Adam live in the presence of documentation of what the bombs actually were. They choose the mythology anyway. Section 23. The endings that never quite end. Every Fallout game ends, and every ending is also a beginning of something the game does not show you. The original Fallout ends with the Vault Dweller defeating the Master and returning to Vault 13, only to be expelled, thanked for saving the Vault, and then told that they have changed too much by their time on the surface to be allowed to remain. This is one of the most devastating endings in games. Not a villain's vengeance, but an institution's self-protective instinct. The recognition that the hero is too different now to fit back into the world that created them. The Vault Dweller walks into the desert alone, and the ending slide tells you that they eventually founded a village. What happened to the Vault Dweller in the years between expulsion and the founding of Arroyo? The gap is never filled. The person who walks out of Vault 13 is one of the most accomplished and arguably one of the most damaged characters in the series. Someone who has killed an immortal mutant philosopher, dismantled a biological weapons program, and been rejected by the community that sent them to do it. What do you do with that? What do you do the day after the story ends? Fallout 2 ends with the destruction of the Enclave's oil rig and the liberation of the New California Republic from the threat of the FEV cleansing program. The Chosen One is also dealt a complex ending. The tribal village that sent them on the quest to find a GECK to revitalize their community is destroyed in their absence by the Enclave, and the Chosen One is left with the complex legacy of having saved a nation while failing to save the people they set out to save in the first place. The ending slides for Fallout 2 are among the most detailed in the series, tracking the various factions and characters of the game into the future, but they raise as many questions as they answer. Fallout 3 ends in the water purifier, or it continues, depending on whether broken steel is installed, and in either case, the fate of the capital Wasteland after the purifier is activated is never revisited in any subsequent game. Clean water is available. The Brotherhood controls the purifier. The Enclave has been defeated. What happened next? A decade later, Fallout 4 is set in Boston rather than DC, which means the consequences of Fallout 3 are referenced but not depicted. The capital Wasteland exists in the fiction, somewhere off-screen, probably changed by the purifier and the decade of relative peace, but the specifics are never addressed. Fallout. New Vegas ends with one of 4 main outcomes and dozens of sub-outcomes that document the fates of the game's major factions and characters in remarkable detail. But even the most detailed slideshow ends in the near future, at most a few years after the events of the game. What the Mojave looks like 20 years later, 50 years later, is unknown. The NCR, if it wins, presumably stabilizes and grows. Caesar's Legion, if it wins, expands and consolidates. Mr. House's New Vegas, if it wins, presumably develops the technology and political infrastructure to become the dominant Western power. But the actual long-term consequences of each ending, the way each victory reshapes the wasteland over decades rather than years, is never shown. Fallout 4 ends with the defeat of whichever faction the player has chosen to destroy, and the beginning of what is implicitly a period of Commonwealth rebuilding. The Minutemen protect the settlements. The Brotherhood polices the region. The Railroad continues its work. The Institute is destroyed, but the Commonwealth is still the Commonwealth. Still dangerous, still struggling, still a long way from anything resembling stable civilization. The ending is a moment of relative peace rather than a resolution, and the silence about what happens next is itself the mystery. The Fallout television series ends with the year 2297, the furthest forward the franchise has yet depicted, with the city of New Vegas apparently still standing, and now the focal point of the next chapter. But even 2297 is not an ending. It is another beginning, another moment of setup for a story that has not yet been told. The Fallout universe does not end. It keeps going, one mystery at a time, into a future that nobody has seen yet, in a world that has been ending and beginning again for 220 years of fiction. And that is perhaps the most interesting mystery of all. Not any specific question about specific lore, but the broader question of whether a world that has been in the process of ending for 200 years can ever fully arrive at something different. Whether the apocalypse is an event or a condition. Whether there is a version of the Wasteland, somewhere in the possible futures of the fiction, where the answer is finally yes. The games have not given us that yet, but they keep building the world where it might happen. And until it does, there are always more questions to ask in the dark, more mysteries to carry with you into the silence, more doors in the Wasteland that you have not yet had reason to open. Sleep well. The Wasteland has been here for 200 years. It can wait until morning. Thank you for spending this time in the Wasteland with me. If you made it to the end, leave a comment with the word Wanderer so I know. And if you drifted off somewhere in the middle, somewhere around the Children of Adam or the things under the Dunwich building, that's exactly the right place to be. Like and subscribe if this is the kind of thing you want more of. I will see you in the next one. Section 24, The Community's Living Archive. How players became historians. There is a dimension of the Fallout mystery tradition that exists entirely outside the games themselves. The community of players who have, over the past 27 years, transformed themselves into the foremost experts on a fictional history that the fiction itself has sometimes gotten wrong. The Fallout community's relationship to the lore is unlike almost any other gaming fandoms, because the lore is genuinely complex enough and genuinely incomplete enough that player expertise has real value. There are questions about the Fallout universe that players know better than the developers, not because the developers got things wrong, but because the players have done the work of synthesizing information across games, DLCs, official guides, developer interviews, cut content, and forum discussions that no single developer was ever responsible for holding in their head simultaneously. The first community mystery is how the lore reconciles across the full breadth of the series. Fallout 1 and 2, developed by Interplay's Black Isle Studios, established a West Coast lore with specific internal rules. Fallout 3 and 4, developed by Bethesda, moved to the East Coast and introduced new elements that sometimes created inconsistencies with the established West Coast lore. Fallout New Vegas, developed by Obsidian Entertainment, many of whose staff worked on the original Innercourse Playgrounds, attempted to bridge the two traditions, but the seams are visible if you look. The question of which lore is more authoritative, the original Interplay vision, the Bethesda expansion, the Obsidian synthesis, is one that the community has argued about extensively and inconclusively. Tim Kaine and Leonard Boyarsky, who created the series, have occasionally spoken about how they would have developed the lore if they had remained in control of it. Todd Howard has the final institutional say over what is canon. The result is a franchise where canonical is a term that requires more qualification than usual. The second community mystery involves the fan theories that have become so thoroughly integrated into community discourse that newcomers sometimes encounter them as established lore. The theory that the lone wanderer is the mysterious stranger. The theory that dogmeat is a continuous lineage rather than individual dogs. The theory that certain pre-war dates and events have specific significance that the games have not directly addressed. These theories live in a borderland between fan creativity and lore interpretation, and the community has developed a sophisticated vocabulary for distinguishing between them, though the line is not always clear. The third community mystery is the question of unreliable narrators in the Fallout fiction. The games present a version of history primarily through documents and dialogue, through people telling you things, and through the records left by people who are no longer alive to correct the record. Both of these sources are potentially unreliable. The Overseer's terminal entries might not be fully honest about what was happening in the vault. A soldier's holotape might reflect their personal biases about the enemies they were fighting. A religious community's documents will describe the Great War in the terms their theology requires. The community has developed practices for cross-referencing these sources and triangulating towards something more reliable, which is itself a sophisticated act of historical methodology applied to a fictional universe. The players of Fallout are, in a genuine sense, its historians, and the work they do in forums and wikis and video essays is a form of historical reconstruction applied to a world that exists only in code. The fourth community mystery is something that emerges from the cumulative work of many players over many years, the sense that the Fallout universe is larger and older than any single game can show, that there is history here that extends in all directions beyond the edges of any playable map. The community has taken this implied largeness seriously in the form of fan fiction, fan games, and the remarkably ambitious Fallout London project, an independently developed Delsey-scale project set in a post-nuclear United Kingdom, which represents an attempt to extend the fiction into the geography it has never officially touched. These community extensions are themselves a form of mystery-making. They ask what the Fallout universe looks like in the places the games have never gone, and they answer that question with the same rigor and attention to lore consistency that the official games bring to their own settings. The fifth community mystery is perhaps the most philosophical. What do we owe to a fictional world that we have spent years living in? The Fallout community has been building its collective understanding of this universe since 1997. People have grown up with these games. People have written dissertations about them. People have formed friendships, relationships, creative partnerships, and careers around their engagement with them. The community has invested something real in a world that is not real. And the question of what that investment means, whether it creates a form of obligation on the part of the creators, whether the player's expertise and emotional investment gives them a legitimate voice in how the fiction develops, is something the community debates explicitly and implicitly through the way it responds to each new game. When Fallout 4 made choices that some portion of the community felt were inconsistent with established lore, the community response was not simply a reaction to a game they did not enjoy. It was a response to changes in a world they had been studying and caring about for years, in some cases decades. The mystery of what the creators owe the community and what the community can reasonably expect from the creators is not specific to Fallout, but it is felt particularly acutely in a franchise with this depth of history. The sixth community mystery is the one that will persist as long as the series does. What comes next? Fallout 5 is eventually coming, though the timeline is deliberately vague, given Bethesda's current commitments to other projects. What questions will it answer, and what new questions will it introduce? Will it return to the West Coast and address the fate of the NCR after Shady Sands? Will it move to a new region entirely? Will it address the overarching question of what Vault-Tec was ultimately trying to achieve? Will it give us the ending that the series has always been building toward, the moment where the cycle finally breaks, where a civilization emerges that does not carry within it the seeds of the catastrophe that created it? The community does not know. Neither, presumably, do the creators with any finality. The future of the Fallout universe is the greatest mystery in a series built on mysteries, and it is one that only time and creative decision-making will resolve. Until then, the Wasteland holds everything it has always held: the questions, the darkness, the distant sound of old music playing from a radio station that has been transmitting into the silence for 200 years. And somewhere in that silence, if you listen closely enough, you can hear the world that was and the world that might be, both at once, layered over each other like geological strata, each one asking its questions in the dark. The lights are low. The wasteland is quiet. The questions will be there when you wake up. Good night, a note on the numbers. There is something appropriate about the fact that the Fallout universe has 122 official vaults, and we have enumerated, across this script, 153 specific mysteries woven through the tomes. The DLCs, the television series, the official guides, and the decades of community investigation that have made the Fallout fandom one of the most analytically rigorous in games. The number is not arbitrary. Every mystery named here is a real question, a thread that, if you pulled it, would lead somewhere interesting. Some of them lead to answers that the series has partially given. The question of who fired the first bombs leads to Tim Kane's interview and the television show's revelation and the productive tension between the two. The question of what the synths are leads to Nick Valentine and Dima and a philosophical argument about consciousness that the games make through their characters rather than their dialogue trees. The question of what Vault-Tec was doing leads to the television series and backward through every vault you have ever explored. Other mysteries lead only to more silence, to the particular darkness at the bottom of the Dunwich borers, to the last entry of Jamie's audio log, to the empty Vault 68 that exists only as a reference in someone else's documents. These mysteries may never be resolved. The Fallout universe has never committed to answering all of its own questions, because the unanswered questions are part of the texture of a world that feels genuinely old and genuinely complex. And then there are the mysteries that the community has decided for itself, the interpretations that have become so widely shared that they function as answers even without official confirmation. The mysterious stranger as the aging lone wanderer, the Dunwich borers as the site of something genuinely supernatural, the Enclave as the architect of its own apocalypse. These are theories, not facts, but they are the kind of theories that a living community builds around a living fiction, and their existence is itself a testament to how deeply the Fallout universe has been inhabited. 153 mysteries, 24 sections, 200 years of history, and 2 decades of player engagement, all pointing toward a world that keeps asking questions in the dark and never quite runs out of new ones. The Wasteland endures, so does the wondering.